All right. It looks like we're recording. Therefore, I say unto you, hail. Welcome to question and answer number 114. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and this is my beverage. I will remove the classy and sophisticated paper umbrella. Take a little drink of it. And then I shall commence to answering questions. At leastwise, I'm fixing to start commencing at any rate. So, the first question is from RFS. And RFS has asked the same question twice because he asked one onto an older Q&A after I'd already gleaned the questions from the comments there. So then he asked it again on the previous Q&A, which was a good thing to do, I suppose. Although I think I had already recorded the first version of his question. So he's got two versions of the same question here, which only counts as one question. And it is as follows. Venerable Sir, I am traveling to Thailand from America, and it will be my first time in a Buddhist country. What is the proper procedure for offering food to monks? For example, if I cook steaks for the monks, do I need to wrap them individually, cut them into single pieces? Question mark. And then the second version omits the steaks. And he says, I am traveling to Thailand from America, and it will be my first time in a Buddhist country. What is the proper procedure for offering food to monks? Is the food portioned, wrapped individually, then offered? Please help me to not appear like a barbarian. And it's good that you want to offer food to the monks, although it varies from place to place how exactly it is done. Like, for example, sometimes in Burma, there are some places in Thailand also where people will offer only white rice into the monks' bowls when they go for alms round, and all the curry and non-rice food is just sent to the monastery, which is kind of a strange way of going about it. Also, some places in Burma, monks will accept curry, like other things besides rice and maybe unpeeled fruit and so forth, only if they've got little curry cups on top of their bowl. Whereas other places, everyone just dumps the food right in with the rice. And so you may have to look around and see how other people are offering food in order to know how to do it, in accordance with the tradition in that particular area. So like the first day, you might just want to watch other people there who are offering food and then kind of imitate them. If they're only offering rice and not offering anything besides rice other than maybe like a banana or something, then you should go like that. The monks may not appreciate you dumping soup or fried vegetables or whatever into their bowl if they're only accepting rice. But it depends. Other places, like if I remember correctly in Bangkok, when I went for alms round there, like in 1993, people would offer rice just sometimes in plastic bags. They'd offer curry sometimes, and I think they would offer curry in plastic bags, so that when you got back to the monastery or wherever you went back to eat your meal, you'd have this bowl just full of these plastic bags that you'd have to like sort through. And also in Bangkok, it's a common thing for, at least in 1993, for them to offer bags of water too. So you get these little bags of just drinking water. So you might want to carry, well, if you're a monk, you'd want to carry a shoulder bag or something. Some places like in the city of Monua in Burma, around May and June, which is mango season, the mangoes are ripe then. You have to carry a great big sack with you to put all the mangoes in because everyone's offering mangoes. But with regard to offering the food, my advice to you, because it varies from place to place on what is the accepted traditional way of offering food, just go out and watch the first day and see what the other people are doing. If they're only offering white rice, then just, you'll know the monks are accepting white rice, or they probably would accept like fruit, that kind of thing. But any kind of saucy, gloppy stuff, some monks don't accept it in some places. Other places, they accept it. only if they've got curry cups on them, or you offer it in a plastic bag. Other places, they'll just have it all dumped into their bowl. So I can't really say exactly what would be the correct way, although, I mean, just etiquette. I mean, you take your shoes off before you put the food into a monk's bowl. So at least you should know to do it barefoot and do it respectfully. Use both hands. Or if it's something that really only takes one hand, you can just put your second hand like on your forearm so that you're still using both hands to offer it, because that's just like showing that you are wholeheartedly giving, with both hands. And that's really all I can think of at present. But my main advice with regard to how to offer food properly, watch what the other people are doing on the first day, and then just kind of follow along with what they're doing, so that you'll know whether to put it into a plastic bag or just dump it straight in, or just offer rice and take the other stuff directly to the monastery, that sort of thing. So, and I do hope that you won't discredit us Western barbarians. So, I'm just going to move on to the next question, and this is from Cherzaskazes. And Cherzaskazes, I think this first question might be rhetorical, because I kind of already answered it in the comments to the previous Q&A. But Cherzaskazes says, is China really communist? They look wealthy and prosperous. And I had to answer that question twice in the comments, because my first answer just disappeared, which does happen on YouTube. I'm not the one who's doing it. I mean, technically, China is communist because the country is ruled by an organization called the Chinese Communist Party. But they're not purely communist anymore, because they realize communism cannot compete economically with capitalism. And so they've added a little bit sort of like government supervised capitalism into the system. So now it's more along the lines of like fascism. And I mean, you can have Marxist fascism. You can have a country that's more or less communist and also fascist at the same time. North Korea is a good example of this. So it is kind of like, I mean, in fascism, you do have some capitalism, but it is regulated by the government much more than in a place like the USA. You got price controls, that kind of thing is all fair game. And when Cherzaskazes says that China looks wealthy and prosperous, mainly you're just seeing Beijing, Shanghai, and some of the bigger industrial cities in the bigger industrial centers of those cities. But most Chinese people would be living below the poverty level by Western standards. So you're not seeing a representational sample of Chinese people when you say Chinese people look wealthy and prosperous. China is still relatively undeveloped out in the red states of China, the flyover areas of China. So I'm just going to move on to Cherzaskazes' second question. And Cherzaskazes may not pronounce his last name or his name the same way I'm doing it, but some people are just silly and can't pronounce their own name correctly. So, Cherzaskazes' second question here is, why do you think quite a lot of old people are bitter and angry, the opposite of children and youth? I think a lot of old people are bitter and angry just because they're not as well equipped to enjoy life anymore. It reminds me of the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament of the Bible, where it's saying that, when you get old, you don't enjoy life anymore, or you don't enjoy it as much. Life becomes more of just kind of something to endure. It's like your sex drive goes down. You can't really enjoy sex so much. You can't really enjoy your food so much, partly because, tomatoes don't agree with you anymore, or, just this causes indigestion, or it's just that like your senses have become dulled. And so largely it's like some of the negative aspects of life, like physical ailments, tend to increase, and some of the positive aspects, especially in the sensual realm, decrease. And so a lot of people, especially if they were sensual people when they were younger, and they're not very adaptable, they're not very resilient in that way, life just becomes an unpleasant thing for them. Also, there can be a lot of just bitterness over a life badly spent. They kind of don't want to face the fact that they didn't live up to their ideals, their dreams, their ambitions, that kind of a thing. So there can be some of that too. But I think one of the main reasons why old people are bitter and angry is, they have got like chronic discomfort or pain, in addition to just a decreased capacity to enjoy sensual pleasures. And if you're not feeling good, you're more likely to be in a bad mood. And a lot of older people, they got these aches and pains and, stomach problems and different issues that just kind of wear down on them, and they can be in a bad mood. And then they start yelling at kids to get off their lawn and that kind of thing. But of course, there's also individual conditions, individual aspects that apply to this old person who's bitter and angry. Different set of issues apply to that old person who's bitter and angry. But I think in general, it's just greater discomfort in the body and less capacity to enjoy sensual pleasures. So that would apply mainly to normie type older people who really were into sensual pleasures when they were younger and just can't enjoy them as much as they are accustomed. So I'm just going to move on to Trzaskaz's third question, which is kind of an interesting one. Not that other questions aren't interesting, but this is the first time anyone's ever asked this one, as far as I can remember. Why Buddha, Mahavira, Lao Tzu, Confucius, Zoroaster, and first Greek philosophers lived in 6th century BC? What happened in 6th century BC that enabled this religious awakening? Well, first of all, I would point out that a lot of Buddhistic scholars nowadays are saying that the Buddha probably didn't really live in the 6th century BC. It was more like the 5th century BC. Also, Lao Tzu may not have existed as a historical figure. Some academics are trying to at least hypothesize that Lao Tzu was really just a garbled version of the Buddha, which would mean that Lao Tzu also didn't live in the 6th century BCE. Zoroaster or Zarathustra, I'm pretty sure a lot of scholars anyway think that he was before the 6th century BCE, before Common Era. So it's not necessarily the case that all these people really did live in the 6th century BCE, but they did live in what is called the axial age. And that's a term coined by a German philosopher named Karl Jaspers. I think at least for a while he was an existentialist. He was also somewhat of a historian, and he coined the term axial age. And let's see here. A lot of what I know about the axial age, I read in this book. This is sort of like my introduction to the axial age. It's A History of God by Karen Armstrong. It's a good book, worth reading. It's sort of like a history of Western monotheism. And she says a few things like, let's see here. The individual conscience, the good life, and the question of justice in society were like issues for the axial age. And she had like a brief introduction to the axial age, which I will include here. This is Karen Armstrong saying, I won't try to imitate her voice, so bear with me here. The period 800 to 200 BCE has been termed the axial age. In all the main regions of the civilized world, people created new ideologies that have continued to be crucial and formative. The new religious systems reflected the changed economic and social conditions. For reasons that we do not entirely understand, all the chief civilizations developed along parallel lines, even when there was no commercial contact as between China and the European area. There was a new prosperity that led to the rise of a merchant class. Power was shifting from king and priest, temple and palace to the marketplace. The new wealth led to intellectual and cultural fluorescence and also to the development of the individual conscience. Inequality and exploitation became more apparent as the pace of change accelerated in the cities and people began to realize that their own behavior could affect the future or the fate of future generations. Each region developed a distinctive ideology to address these problems and concerns. Taoism and Confucianism in China, Hinduism and Buddhism in India, and philosophical rationalism in Europe. The Middle East did not produce a uniform solution, but Iran and Israel, Zoroaster and the Hebrew prophets respectively evolved different versions of monotheism. Strange as it may seem, the idea of God, like the other great religious insights of the period, developed in a market economy in a spirit of aggressive capitalism. And with regard to India and Buddhism, I've read, elsewhere in different books that really it was a kind of social revolution, like the beginnings of like a money economy and the center of society moving away from large plantations in the countryside to cities. That helped to produce Buddhism. So it was sort of a change in the way society was structured, led to this ferment, a lot of despair, a lot of war and upheaval, revolution, that kind of stuff, which led to new ways of thinking and more individuality, more emphasis on like the individual conscience and, how a person should try to live a good life rather than just conformity and following along with tradition or with whatever the king decreed or whatever the priests decreed, that sort of thing. So I do think that the answer to this question is not so much with regard to the 6th century BCE as just that general time period in human history. There was definitely a kind of revolution that is still with us today. The results of that revolution. It's just an increase on the individual person and just also ideas of, social justice, for lack of a better word. I know social justice has gotten some really negative connotations lately due to a certain amount of hysterical silliness of the early 21st century. So I suppose I answered that question. Or rather, Karen Armstrong answered it through me. I was channeling Karen Armstrong there. And so I'm just going to move on to Cherzaskaz's 4th question. Oh my goodness. Some people, they just don't care. They just go right ahead and ask that 4th question, don't they? Shame. So anyways, Cherzaskaz transgressively asks, long time ago I asked you what 2nd jhana feels like, and now I'm asking what 3rd jhana feels like. And just going with the text, 3rd jhana, first of all, you're not thinking anymore. You're in a heightened state of awareness. Your mindfulness is very intense, and you're no longer feeling like emotional pleasure and pain, but you're still capable of feeling physical pleasure and pain. And that is, you can't really describe how it feels exactly, especially to someone who's never felt it before. It's like trying to explain what sound sounds like to a person who was born deaf, or what color looks like to someone who was born blind. If you've never experienced it before, then you can kind of extrapolate, get into your most lucid moments, your memory of your most lucid moments, and then extrapolate to that, to a point where you're not thinking anything, you're just wide awake. And you've just gone beyond emotional pain and pleasure, but you're still capable of feeling physical pain and pleasure. And at 4th jhana, even the physical pain and pleasure, that's gone too. And you're just in a state of pure mindfulness. So just you can chew on that. It's probably not going to help much in really knowing what it feels like, because you've got to feel it yourself. You know, it's like someone asks you what vanilla tastes like. Somebody out there, they come from some remote area. They never tasted vanilla before. They ask you, what does vanilla taste like? What are you going to tell them? You could sit there and explain and explain and explain until you're exhausted and hoarse. They're going to be clueless with regard to what vanilla tastes like. The only way to tell them what vanilla tastes like is to tell them where to find some vanilla and then advise them strongly, strenuously, vehemently, taste it for yourself, and then you'll find out, which is what the Buddha was doing with regard to Dhamma and enlightenment and so forth. He's not explaining what Nibbana is like. He's just telling you how to experience it for yourself, because that's really the only way to know. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, what's wrong with a person if they can't seem to commit to anything? Always second guessing what they say, do, and think sounds like skeptical doubt, but for everything. Well, it seems like a lack of determination, lack of adhitthana. And I mean, I used to be this way. Sometimes I would just sort of amaze myself, like as a monk. It's time to open a new water bottle. I'd go and it's like, which water bottle should I open? They're exactly the same. They're all the same water. You know, it's all the same brand even. I mean, what difference does it make? But I would actually stop and hesitate and like, well, maybe this one, and then I realize that it's just silly. And so eventually you have to reach a point of maybe emotional maturity, maybe you could call it that, where it's just, I got to just do this even if I do it wrong. You know, just like over-analysis paralysis can just like be a handicap for a lot of people. So eventually you just got to get to the point where you allow yourself a certain amount of time to make a decision, then you make that decision and follow through with it. I mean, it may be at some point you realize this is the wrong decision. This isn't going to work. There's a better way of doing it. So then you can change. But if you're just thinking, well, I'm not so sure about this, eventually you just got to get to the point where it's like, I'm doing this even if I do it wrong, and then just go for it. And that takes a certain amount of adhitthana or determination, which is one of the 10 paramis. It's something that can be cultivated. And mindfulness, when you start second guessing yourself and starting to get wishy-washy or whatever, just note that and realize that it's not really you. It's just habitual thought patterns arising. So what's wrong with a person if they can't seem to commit to anything? Yeah, it's a lack of determination and some over-analysis paralysis and just thinking too much. Also, just maybe not enough experience in life to really appreciate the idea that just doesn't work very well. That at some point you've got to make a decision. I mean, you don't have forever to make the decision. You've got time constraints because you got to make other decisions after that. So you just make the decision. I mean, you might have to contemplate it as long as you still have time. You know, you might know, how much time do I have to come to the conclusion that I have to come to? But then once you come to that conclusion, you have to act upon it. And you just continue acting upon it until it becomes obviously impossible to do it that way, or you suddenly see a better way of doing it. And then there's nothing wrong with switching, but still you've got to be able to commit to something. And I mean, it's like, to some degree, it's like Western people, it's like committing, like marriage, for example. I'm pretty sure at least half of marriages in the West fail. It's just people can't really commit. In the old days, it was like for better or for worse. You vow to God in a church before a priest or a minister that you will be together for better, for worse, till death do us part. And then 2 years later, you get divorced because maybe the sex isn't all that good. You just can't agree on the budget. Somebody is spending too much money or something, and it's over. And it's just lack of determination and just sort of lack of a kind of equanimity where you're willing to put up with that kind of stuff. Because in older times, pre-modern times, even well into modern times, it was like if you're in a bad situation, you just put up with it because you made the decision and now you are bound to that decision. So I hope I answered that question, because I'm moving on to CO Vakshin Sipad Zirna's next question, which is, I have heard you criticize the commentary of Buddhaghosa in some places, but what are your overall thoughts on it, as well as the commentaries of Vazu Bandhu, Asanga, the Vimutti Magga, etc.? Well, before I start raging against Buddhaghosa, I will point out that Vazu Bandhu and Asanga, I'm pretty sure they weren't writing Theravada Buddhist commentaries, and I've never read anything by them. I've read something about them, but yeah, I'm really not familiar with the commentaries of Vazu Bandhu or Asanga. You know, they are significant in the history of Buddhism in general in ancient India, but they're not Theravada Buddhists. I didn't really study them all that much. The Vimutti Magga was Theravadan, or at least proto-Theravadan, and the Visuddhi Magga, which is the central commentary in the Buddhist commentarial literature, the Tathagatas. It's sort of like the hub, with the other commentaries being like spokes going out from the hub on this wheel. The Visuddhi Magga, which was composed by Buddhaghosa, was based on the Vimutti Magga. And the Vimutti Magga was sort of pre-Orthodox, proto-Orthodox, and so a lot of it got changed. I have seen a copy of the Vimutti Magga, which had disappeared. It was like at some time in the 20th century, it finally got rediscovered. It was like an old manuscript of it was found in some monastery in Sri Lanka, so that scholars became aware of it and it started getting translated in English and published in books and so forth. So I have seen a copy of it. I wasn't really that much interested in reading the whole thing, because I'm really not all that interested in commentaries. I have more faith in my own judgment in many cases than I have in the judgment of these early medieval scholastic monks from South India and Sri Lanka. Because if you read the commentaries, it's Buddhaghosa's commentaries, especially since he's in question here, they really are making wild guesses sometimes. And they never, or very rarely, do they admit that they're making guesses. And so they're sort of giving like an orthodox interpretation of what the texts say, and sometimes it deviates quite a lot from what the texts say. So that the Burmese, who are complete dogmatists, or most Burmese scholar monks, are very dogmatic. They have like a medieval attitude towards the texts. Checking to see that, yeah, we are recording. So they can't doubt even the commentaries. Everything in the commentaries has to be true. They believe that the commentaries are the words of the Buddha that were like transmitted outside of the Pali canon until finally they were edited and translated in Sri Lanka, because there was this body of commentarial literature that at the time was mostly in Sinhalese in early medieval Sri Lanka. And it may be that Buddhaghosa and probably a lot of other monks translated them from Sinhalese back into Pali again. It's a more elaborate kind of scholastic Pali than you're going to find in the earlier Pali texts. You know, the whole writing style and grammar and so forth are obviously, it's obviously more convoluted, more Byzantine than the earlier texts. Harder to read than the earlier texts. And a lot of time they're just guessing. They really, like, for example, I mean, I could give a lot of examples, but for example, there's in the Vinaya, the rules of monastic discipline, there's a list of the allowable fabrics, the allowable materials for which a monk's robe can be made. So it's cotton, linen, wool, silk, banga, and sana. Or sana comes first. Sana and banga. And banga is hemp. Sana is sun hemp, which has the same etymology, sun hemp or Bengal hemp, as the Pali word sana. The writers of the commentaries who lived in the South apparently did not have access to sun hemp, which is Bengal hemp, which lives in the north. It's like subtropical, or it's a different climate there. So they didn't know what sana meant. So they said sana means hemp. And banga, which really does mean hemp, they said that's any combination of the above, which has no etymological support. It's just, they just pulled it out of an orifice, essentially. Or another example is in the texts, for example, in the rules of monastic discipline, in the beginning of the chapter on bhikkhunis or nuns, the Buddha says, because nuns are being ordained now, the sanghas, or the true Dhamma, is only going to last half as long. It's only going to last 500 years. So the commentators like Buddhaghosa, they can't say the Buddha was wrong. They can't say that the Buddha didn't really say that, because, they have to assume that it's all the teaching of Buddha. So they say, when the Buddha said 500 years, what he meant was 5,000 years. And why he would say 500 when he meant 5,000, they don't bother with that. How anybody could have understood the Buddha when he said 500 meaning 5,000, they didn't have a commentary to refer to. They're just sitting there listening to his words, and he's saying 500. How's anybody going to know that he meant 5,000? How did the commentators know that he meant 5,000? They just have, it's just this weird tradition. And so in a place like Burma that's very dogmatic, the commentaries actually are more authoritative than the Pali texts themselves. Because, for example, when the Buddha says 500, if you didn't follow the commentaries, you wouldn't know that when he said 500, he really meant 5,000. It's like when the commentary says, when the Buddha says blue, what he really means is red. If you didn't have the commentaries, you wouldn't know that it means red when he says blue. So actually, the commentaries are, in a way, more authoritative than the Pali texts themselves to just devout, dogmatic Theravada Buddhists, at least of the Burmese variety. So a lot of serious Western monks just avoid the commentaries. A lot of serious Western monks don't even bother with the Visuddhimagga. And the commentarial tradition has a lot of stuff in it that is kind of a corruption of Dhamma that is not really in the text. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of this, like Abhidhamma, for example, some of the basic main teachings of Abhidhamma aren't even found in the Abhidhamma Pitaka. They're found in the commentaries to the Abhidhamma. All the Chitta Vritti, the different mind moments, Rupa Kalapas, all this kind of stuff that's found in like all these ultimate realities, the lists of ultimate realities and all that. It's not in the Pali texts, not in the Pali Tipitaka, like the Abhidhamma Pitaka. It's in the commentaries. So, in a way, Buddhaghosa is sort of like Paul of Tarsus, in a way. It's a loose analogy, but at the same time that he sort of standardized and, largely created Orthodox Theravada, he also kind of messed it up a bit, which is, in my opinion, what St. Paul did to Christianity. At the same time that he was turning Christianity into a world religion, he was also just fucking it up to some degree. Hope I haven't just offended Christians out there. But in my opinion, St. Paul really, in a way, he's as important as Jesus of Nazareth himself with regard to making a mass religion out of Christianity. But at the same time, he distorted it in weird ways that kind of corrupted the original teachings. So, yeah, I used to rail against Buddhaghosism. I'm a Buddhist, not a Buddhaghosist. So, I guess I've done some, let's see. What are my overall thoughts? Yeah, those are some of my overall thoughts. And so I'm just going to move on to Seal of Action Sipat Zidana's third question, which is about the Cook Sutta, which is Samyutta Nikaya 47-8. And he's got this long quote here. This is supposedly the Buddha who is speaking here. This is the sutta. Suppose that there is a foolish, incompetent, unskillful cook who has presented a king or a king's minister with various kinds of curry, mainly sour, mainly bitter, mainly peppery, mainly sweet, alkaline or non-alkaline, salty or non-salty. He doesn't take note of his master thinking, today my master likes this curry, or he reaches out for that curry, or he takes a lot of this curry, or he praises that curry. Today my master likes mainly sour curry. Today my master likes mainly bitter curry, mainly peppery curry, mainly sweet curry, alkaline curry, non-alkaline curry, salty curry. Today my master likes non-salty curry, or he reaches out for non-salty curry, or he takes a lot of non-salty curry, or he praises non-salty curry. As a result, he is not rewarded with clothing or wages or gifts. Why is that? Because the foolish, incompetent, unskillful cook doesn't take note of his own master. In the same way, there is the case where a foolish, incompetent, unskillful monk remains focused on the body in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, subduing greed and distress with reference to the world. Subduing greed and distress with reference to the world, as he remains thus focused on the body in and of itself, his mind doesn't become concentrated. His defilements are not abandoned. He doesn't take note of that fact. He remains focused on feelings in and of themselves, the mind in and of itself, mental qualities in and of themselves, ardent, alert, and mindful, subduing greed and distress with reference to the world. As he remains thus focused on mental qualities in and of themselves, his mind doesn't become concentrated. His defilements are not abandoned. He doesn't take note of that fact. As a result, he is not rewarded with a pleasant abiding here and now, nor with mindfulness and alertness. Why is that? Because the foolish, incompetent, unskillful monk doesn't take note of his own mind. So then Siovakchin Sipadzina says, this sutta calls someone a fool who seems to be doing everything right on paper, but not getting the result. What was he supposed to do? I don't get what the simile is trying to tell us and what taking note of his own mind means. Well, it seems to me, let's just start with the cook. The cook, he might be a really good cook. He might cook food that's really good, but the thing is, it's like he's not taking into consideration what the king actually wants to eat. So it's like he's not taking into consideration the person who's eating the food. He's just making, salty food when maybe the king isn't in the mood for salty food. He's making sweet food when maybe the king is in a mood for savory food, that kind of thing. So then when you get to the monk who's concentrating on, whatever it is he's concentrating on, the way I interpret this to mean possibly, this is my provisional interpretation, is that he's not comparing that with the effects this meditation is having on his overall disposition. In a sense, he is the cook and the king at the same time. So it might be that he's getting into deep meditation when he's sitting there, but he's not really noticing that when he gets up and starts walking around, he's still got all these defilements that aren't being attended to. It's like the meditation isn't causing sufficient insight to arise that he's able to really change his personality. It might be just he's in a kind of rut. Maybe he's sort of dissociates when he meditates. A lot of people are like this. They can sit down and just sit there like a rock. They just go into this deep state of samadhi or whatever, but it's sort of dissociated. There aren't any open doors between that state and their ordinary waking state. So when they meditate, all it does is make them a better meditator. It doesn't really improve the rest of their life because it's like there's hardly any communication at all between this meditative state that they're cultivating and might be getting into deep states and their ordinary waking life. So I think the cook is the king in that he's the monk is doing deep meditation. But then he gets up and he still gets pissed off when crows are making lots of noise, or he's irritated by visitors bugging him, or he still has these attachments to food or attachments to women or whatever it is. It's like he's getting into these deep meditative states, but he's not really applying that to his own overall state. So that would be my provisional interpretation. It may be that the sutta is longer and I might get more context from reading the whole thing, but from what I have seen of it, that would be my interpretation of it. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Liberlam. And Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Liberlam, says, would prayer work the same as mettā, where you can direct it at individuals but not groups of people? Or can you actually direct mettā at multiple targets? And before I answer this question or attempt to answer it, I would just like to say, if I seem to be talking a little faster than usual or a little more animated than usual, I did coffee Leroy Jenkins this morning, where I drank more than I usually drink of coffee. Also, I ate an entire octopus this morning, which kind of is settling oddly in my innards. And so I'm on a caffeine Leroy Jenkins at present. Just not really trying to do that, but I realized it was like my third cup of coffee. I was sitting in a restaurant where I ate the octopus, and they gave me a free refill, and maybe I should have turned it down, but here we are. This isn't coffee that I'm drinking, by the way. It's just bovine glandular secretions. So anyways, getting back to Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Liberlam's question here. I might as well ask it again because you may have forgotten what the question was. Would prayer work the same as mettā, where you can direct it at individuals but not groups of people, or can you actually direct mettā at multiple targets? Well, yeah, actually you can direct mettā towards all sentient beings in the entire cosmos simultaneously. If you read the text on how a monk sends mettā, I mean, he may send mettā by category, all female beings, all male beings, all human beings, all subhuman beings, all superhuman beings. Also, a monk can just beam mettā in directions. First he beams mettā in the east, then he beams mettā to the west, then to the north, then to the south, then upwards, then downwards. It's like, it's sort of like a radio broadcast or something. And with regard to prayer, you can pray to more than one being too. I mean, just at a secular level, you can have somebody standing before a tribunal or a jury praying to the whole tribunal or the whole jury to have mercy on him, for example. I mean, that would be kind of like a human worldly example of prayer. But to a polytheist, an ancient Greek or some Hindus nowadays, they might be praying to all the gods simultaneously, or at least to their favorite ones. They might throw in their guru in that prayer also. So I think prayer and mettā can both be directed towards multiple targets simultaneously. So, yeah, I mean, definitely if you read the Pali text, a monk can be beaming mettā just at any direct. It's just scattershot in one direction, then another direction, or just by category or whatever, which is, in a way, it strikes me as just too intellectual and cerebral a way to be beaming genuine mettā. But that's just me. It's one reason why I've never really took mettā meditation extremely seriously as a viable practice for myself. It just seems to me that mettā is best directed spontaneously. And when I have prayed in the past, like I mentioned this in a previous Q&A, it has generally been in the past when I was in a state of just wits and despair. And then I would just be praying to anyone out there who is willing and able to help, which presumably would be like devas or like sages, guardian spirits, anybody like that. And if there was more than one, that was fine with me. So, yeah, I think prayer and mettā can be beamed into multiple targets simultaneously, although it may be that, just judging from the way the mind works, it may work best at a single target. People tend to be kind of simple-minded, like mathematicians still haven't figured out how to do like a 3-body problem where you've got to be like taking consideration into like 3 variables simultaneously. It's like you got to narrow it down in order to be able to handle it mentally, because we're just humans. And it may be that sending mettā or prayers to another being, you might start anyway at just a single target until you get really good at it, and then try and spread it out from there. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, which is, what goes into contemplation of and meditation on the earth element? Yeah, not very many people meditate on the earth element anymore, especially earth kasina. And when I saw this question, I was mainly just thinking of earth kasina, which is one of the 40 standardized meditation methods you find in the Visuddhimagga, which I was talking about a few minutes previously. And with the earth kasina, you just make a circle is on like a flat, like a board, like a white board. You would just like paint a circle out of mud and let it dry, and then you've got like this dirt disc that you contemplate on, and you really don't have to think much of anything. You might just be thinking earth, 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 but mainly it's just like a hypnotic device that you focus your attention on, and you don't even really need to be thinking of anything. And with regard to meditation just on the 4 elements in general, you could emphasize earth element on meditation on the 4 elements. And earth element, according to Buddhist philosophy, mainly just means hardness or solidity. So it's like the firmness, the resistance to pressure is mainly the earth element. It's not so much just dirt. Like the ancient Greek philosophers, they considered earth element to mean that there was just sort of like this elemental form of matter that was earth element. But in Buddhist philosophy, it's more of like a quality. It's the quality of hardness that is the earth element, or the resistance to pressure. It's just kind of a solidity kind of a thing. And I've never really done it systematically. I've never done earth kasina. Also, I have read that you can just take like a round plate or something and just put dirt on that, but you couldn't really tip it sideways so that you could see it as a circle without the dirt falling off. So you'd be more of like an ellipse when you're seeing it kind of from the side, which seems to me it wouldn't be as effective. If kasina is supposed to be a disc or a circle, ideally you're supposed to see it as a circle. So, I mean, I minored in chemistry in college also. I've never really had much use for the 4 elements idea in Buddhism. It's just kind of an arbitrary thing. They started off probably with more of an ancient Greek idea of really 4 elements in like an alchemical approach to explaining physical reality. Earth element is like solidity, water element is cohesion, fire element is temperature, and air element is like the kinetic aspect or motion. And that's supposedly accounts for the physical universe, at like a physical level. And I mean, I just don't think that way. I took a minor in chemistry, and it just doesn't work for me. It has never really struck traction with me at all. It just seems like a geocentric universe kind of a thing. It's like, I can understand where they're coming from, but it just doesn't work for me. I mean, why bother to like meditate on the earth as the center of the universe? Maybe you've got the sun and moon and planets going around with epicycles, the way Ptolemaic astronomy was working with circles within circles to account for the fact that it was really an ellipse, and they couldn't really accept the idea that orbits were elliptical because Aristotle, who was like god emperor of philosophers in the West in those days, said that in outer space, everything moves in a circle. And it just went without question up until people like, what was his name? Oh man, I'm drawing a blank. It wasn't Copernicus, it wasn't Galileo. It was this other guy who came up with the elliptical orbits. So, yeah, what goes into the contemplation of a meditation on the earth element? I mean, it can be nothing more than using a disc made of painted mud, painted onto a white background as just like a hypnotic object. You don't even have to be thinking about earth at all is just a convenient circle for you to be focusing your attention on as a kind of hypnotic object, which, I mean, you might be hypnotizing yourself. I do think that Visuddhimagga, it's largely a manual on self-hypnosis. I know a lot of meditators would disagree with that, but that was, when I read it, it struck me. My father was an amateur hypnotist. I know a little more about hypnotism than most Buddhists do, I guess. And so I do realize that, like, for example, in Burma, a lot of people just cannot tell the difference between hypnotic trance, like auto-hypnosis, and jhāna. And it may be that Buddhaghosa also was not really all that great at telling the difference between self-hypnosis and like samma samadhi, right concentration. So, I mean, if you're just meditating on the four elements, though, then it's an intellectual exercise. You're not going to get into very deep meditation because you have to keep thinking. So you're never going to get past first jhana. And so I would recommend, I mean, if you want to do earth kasina, you can do that, although you might be better off with like light kasina or white kasina, something like that. It might work better. And the four elements, I mean, you're going to have to find someone who's really good at meditating on the four elements, who can then tell you the benefits of meditating on the four elements. Because for me, you know, it's like meditating on some obsolete alchemical idea. And because you have to just keep thinking, you're not going to get into very deep meditation. So I'm just going to move on to the next question from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Liberlam, which is as possible. Are assertions about Aristotelian logic being universal confounded by the nature of meditation, where there can be signlessness and suspension of bodily feeling, where such logics have no basis for being considered? So, yeah, I mean, essentially, Aristotelian logic works fine for a rationalist. And like we were talking about in the axial age manifested in the West, at least according to Karen Armstrong, as rationalist philosophy. That's how we Europeans dealt with the axial age, by coming up with rationalism. And rationalism has its limitations, and there are limitations to it, definitely. And it doesn't apply to reality. It applies to sort of a certain structure of human thought, you know, like mathematics, geometry, like Euclidean geometry, these kind of things. You know, they're valid within the context of human psychology, but out there, you know, beyond the limitations of human psychology, they're largely meaningless. So, I mean, anyone having a mystical experience, even that is transcendence of Aristotelian logic. And one of the first essays that I wrote for my first blog, in which I was trying to refute Venerable Gnanapira's hatred of mysticism, because he just didn't understand mysticism. He just loathed mysticism because he said it violates the laws of thought. But I mean, if you think about it, there's all kinds of things that can violate the laws of thought. In my example, it was a Coke bottle, a Coca-Cola bottle made of glass, not plastic. An old-fashioned glass Coca-Cola bottle. Well, which is it? Is it glass or is it a bottle? Well, it's both. It's glass and it's a bottle. But glass and bottle are not synonyms. Glass is not the same as bottle. Therefore, if glass is A, bottle is not A. So that Coke bottle is A and not A simultaneously. And that just violates the laws of thought. You can't have A equals not A. That's just tramples with hobnailed jackboots the Aristotelian laws of thought. But it's right there in that Coke bottle. So Aristotelian logic, it definitely has its advantages. You know, it helps to weed out sloppy thinking, but still it has its limitations too. And it's not just even limited to like rationalistic thought, because any normie can perceive a Coca-Cola bottle and see that it's 100% glass and 100% bottle simultaneously, with glass and bottle not meaning the same thing. The ancient Greeks, they had these, it was almost like Zeno's paradoxes, where you've got 3 people. Let's just, for the sake of me not having come up with Greek names, let's just call them A, B, and C. You got person A, person B, person C. Now, person B is taller than person C, but shorter than person A, which the Greeks considered to be a kind of paradox because he was tall and short at the same time, taller than and shorter than simultaneously. But it depends on the context. And they just couldn't really deal with it at the time. So, yeah, Aristotelian logic, it's universal within a certain context of human psychology, but it's not just absolutely universal. It's not some law of the entire universe. So I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Librelamb's transgressive 4th question, and I've already raised his name up to shame and ridicule on the Discord server. Shame. Really, you guys, what's this world coming to? Anyways, Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Librellamb, says, would it be skillful for the average normie to repent for their wrong view instead of upholding some contrived fight for right view? Well, I mean, repent, what is the meaning of repent? Repent generally involves a certain amount of remorse, contrition, which really is not considered to be a wise mental state from a Buddhist point of view. And how are you going to repent for your wrong view if you still have it? That's not good. If you are repenting of something that you're still doing, let's say somebody's committing adultery, they're having an affair, and they're repenting of it while still doing it. What good is that? But in order to stop having wrong view, you have to acquire right view. Otherwise you've just switched from one wrong view to a different wrong view, and you're repenting one wrong view while still wallowing in this newer wrong view, which I don't see the benefit of that either, unless maybe it's just a somewhat less crude kind of wrong view. So, let's see. I need to ask the question again. Would it be skillful for the average normie to repent for their wrong view instead of upholding some contrived fight for right view? Well, if they're willing to acknowledge that everyone is crazy, putujino umatako, all normies are insane, then, that would be a good starting point. Just acknowledge that, yeah, I don't have right view yet. I might not know what right view is because I don't have it yet. But at least I realize that I am a deluded being. That can have some advantage. At least it'll make you a little more humble. But this contrived fight for right view, you don't have to really fight for right view. You just be a seeker. You're looking for right view. You don't have to turn it into a struggle or a battle or anything. You're just out there inquiring while acknowledging that you don't have it yet. That's fine. That works. It's not totally ideal, because totally ideal would mean that you're already enlightened. So, yeah, would it be skill for the average normie to repent for the wrong view? Yeah, it depends on what repent means, but really, I think it should be something more realistic, I guess, because how can you repent of a wrong view while still wallowing in it? So just acknowledge that you have wrong view and aspire or strive or gently move in the direction of finding right view. Just keep seeking. Maybe even after you think you've got right view, continue to seek even so, because you might be mistaken. Because that was the 4th question, I'm just going to call it good and move on to the next question. And we do have a fair amount of questions. It's sort of an average amount of questions, it's in the 40s somewhere. So this next question is from Outer Haven. And Outer Haven says, is there an objective moral standard, and how is it determined? I assume you don't think Joseph Stalin was a good guy, but millions of Russians do. What makes them wrong and you correct? Does it all just boil down to a matter of opinion at the end of the day? And I think somebody in the comments pointed out that his choice of Joseph Stalin was maybe not the best choice, because there probably really aren't that many Russians who really think Stalin was a good guy. For example, I mean, as soon as the Soviet Union fell, Stalingrad got its old name back. I mean, people realize that Stalin was a bad guy. It might be better to have chosen Lenin, because even during the Soviet Union, the average Russian, and they had a pretty good idea that Stalin was a bad guy. But Lenin was kind of deified almost. He was glorified. Lenin was a good guy. It's just that Stalin took over afterwards and ran the Soviet Union into the ground. But that's just, let's see, what makes them wrong and me correct. So I don't think Stalin was a good guy. No, I think in a lot of respects he was worse than Adolf Hitler. He killed more people than Hitler did anyway. And Stalin was mainly killing his own people. Although I guess he was Georgian, so I guess killing Ukrainians wasn't his own people in an ethnic sense. But yeah, Stalin was essentially like a gangster who just rose to the top through ambition and ruthlessness. But let's just set aside Joseph Stalin. As much as we would like to dwell on Stalin, let's just set him aside for the moment. And just get to the main question here is there an objective moral standard, and how is it determined? Well, the objective moral standard in Buddhism anyway is just based on human psychology. That certain actions, especially certain perceptions, are going to take you farther away from enlightenment, and other perceptions are going to take you closer to enlightenment. And that's skillful and unskillful. That which takes you closer to enlightenment, that which causes you to have fewer desires, more contentment, less suffering overall in the long run, is skillful. And what takes you farther away from enlightenment increases your attachments and desires, increases your suffering, that is unskillful. So, I mean, it's just based on how human psychology works. And so, nobody except for a fully enlightened saint is going to be completely a good guy. Maybe, I mean, even an enlightened saint can seem like kind of a jerk sometimes, I suppose. Even the Buddha, according to the text, would scold people, like rebuke people who might have taken offense at that. And they think, well, this Gautama, he's really not a good guy. So they can make those decisions. But ultimately, from a moral standard, it's just whatever gets you closer to enlightenment is good. Whatever takes you farther away from it is bad. That's just what it's based on. So, judging Joseph Stalin itself would be kind of unskillful, because you're not supposed to be judging people anyway. That even just judging people in a way takes you farther away from enlightenment. So, yeah, it doesn't all just boil down to a matter of opinions at the end of the day, unless you're just a normie wallowing in samsara and don't know what ethics is really based on, at least from a dharmic or Buddhist point of view. For a lot of people in the West, if there is any kind of ethical standards, it's utilitarian, or it's based on decrees of God Almighty. And neither one of those really applies in Buddhism. It's just more based on how human psychology works. And because we're all human, our human psychology is very much the same. Is more the same than different. So there are, in a way, within the human species anyway, just sort of universal standards of certain kind of emotions, attitudes, for example, will get us closer to enlightenment. Certain emotions and attitudes will take us farther away from enlightenment. So, and it's, in a way, it's like, for some people, a kind of attitude or action will actually be a step up, an improvement, whereas that same attitude might be a step down for somebody else. So there is that kind of relativism. Like someone who's usually very generous, they offer something and then they just kind of like, I don't want to be doing this, I should be keeping this. They have like a twinge of stinginess when they're offering. I mean, that would be a step down for them because they're kind of moving away from enlightenment. Whereas the person who's always stingy, but this time overcomes the stinginess enough to offer something, he's still experiencing the same amount of twinge of stinginess as the other person, but for him, it's an improvement. So at least he's taken a step upwards, even though it's essentially the same mental state. But just from the amount of kusala and akusala, it would be the same for both people. But at least, for the more advanced person, it would be a step down. And for the less advanced person, it would be a step up. It's sort of like weightlifters. One guy who can bench press 300 pounds, he's never done it before, so that's an improvement. But then this other guy who usually can do 400, he can only do 300, then he's like degenerating. So that shouldn't be too confusing or hard to understand. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Sanguine Ultima. And Sanguine Ultima says, would you say that Mahayana is to Buddhism what Mormonism is to Christianity? And if we're going to go with analogies, just try to find the best analogy, I would say there's probably better analogies than that. Because Mormonism didn't exist until modern times, whereas Christianity had existed for almost 2,000 years before Mormonism came along. Whereas something like Buddhism, I think Mahayana Buddhism, which began in ancient times, it would be more akin to like Gnosticism. So you had like early Christianity, like the Ebionite, the Jewish Christians, from the Near East, the Levant, that would be sort of like early Buddhism. And then you have these Gnostic sects growing up, kind of somewhat based, they're based on Christianity, but then they start having this more cosmic scale of all these ranks of angels and just weird interpretations of what God is and who Jesus was. Some sects considered Jesus never to have been a real human being, which a lot of Mahayana Buddhists think about Gautama Buddha. They've just sort of deified him, that he wasn't really a human being. He just was like the semblance of a human being, that sort of thing. So I think something like Gnosticism would come closer to Christianity with regard, like Mahayana is to Buddhism what Gnosticism, at least some Gnostic sects, would be to Christianity. Because they were ancient and they had the same sort of turning like a straightforward teaching from one person, supposedly, into just this cosmic, elaborate mythology with all these ranks of superhuman beings and so forth. So yeah, I would say Gnosticism comes closer to Mahayana than Mormonism does, like when you're comparing Buddhism and Christianity. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Skoladin or Skuladin. And Skoladin or Skuladin says, how much overlap does the Mahayana bodhisattva and Jesus have in common? So here's another Buddhism and Christianity question. And then his bullet points. He likes these bullet point commentaries after the question. He says, maybe I could use them interchangeably. I'd probably write down Jesus if I'm taking notes, because it's shorter. Yeah, they're not really synonyms, because Jesus is like an individual proper name and bodhisattva is just, especially from the Mahayana point of view, it's just a kind of class of spiritual being. So you wouldn't say that the Buddha, like in a Mahayana text, the Buddha gave this sermon and there were millions of Jesuses in attendance. It just wouldn't make sense. It would sound kind of silly anyhow. So, bodhisattva is just four syllables. Jesus is 2 syllables. You shouldn't be so lazy that you don't want to say an extra 2 syllables. So, how much overlap does the Mahayana bodhisattva and Jesus have in common? It's really hard to say, because it's hard to say exactly, what Jesus was like, assuming that Jesus existed, because sometimes I catch flack from people on Discord or in YouTube comments or BitChute comments or whatever, then they think that I'm just this gullible rube for believing that Jesus even existed. But let's just assume for the sake of argument that Jesus of Nazareth really did exist. And I assume, even though all of the legends aren't based on his life necessarily, any more than, all the legends about Hercules were really based on some proto-historical Dorian warlord or chieftain or something who became known as Hercules. It's just hard to say whether how wise Jesus was, what level of spiritual attainment he attained. A lot of people would say that he was an arahant, that he was beyond a bodhisattva. Other people would say, no, he wasn't an arahant. He got in bad moods. He wept famously. He had doubt when he was nailed up on the cross and all this. So it could be that he was a kind of bodhisattva, not a Buddhist one, apparently, at least not in that lifetime. It may be. It couldn't be that he was a bodhisattva, like a Mahayana Buddhist bodhisattva in a previous life, because the historical Jesus of Nazareth, assuming that he really existed, he was born around the time that Mahayana was beginning to arise in India. So technically, he would be sort of a bodhisattva adjacent, kind of going parallel, a fellow traveler of the bodhisattvas, in a Buddhist sense. It's really hard to say. First of all, because it's hard to say exactly, where Jesus was at, assuming that he even existed. And so it's really a difficult question to answer. It's sort of like a hypothetical or something. So I think I'm just going to move on to Skeladden's next question here, because I really can't say. It's just like two different cultures that had very little overlap at all, saying, how does Jesus overlap with a bodhisattva? It's just, I would have to know way more about Jesus than possibly anybody in the world actually knows. And then setting aside, fervent beliefs, just like actual knowledge. Even the Buddha himself, it's very difficult to know exactly what the Buddha was like, because all we have is these texts, and the texts clearly are not 100% reliable. So I'm just going to move on to Skeladden or Skeladin's next question, which is Prince Myshkin autistic? And he's referring to one of my favorite novels, The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And Prince Myshkin is the protagonist of this novel, The Idiot. And Prince Myshkin is sort of a metaphor or a parable for Jesus. So we're getting a lot of Jesus questions in this Q&A. And is Prince Myshkin autistic? Well, let's just read the bullet point commentary before I try to answer that. He says, I noticed that the prince keeps being labeled by midwits as an idiot. In the USSR and America, the old term used for autism was idiot savant. Yeah, well, not all autistic people are idiot savants. The person who just almost can't talk and just like clutches a spoon all the time, and they might be autistic, but they're not necessarily a savant. They're not like Rain Man who can just do 7-digit like square roots in his head, that kind of thing. But in Russia, I don't remember the word in Russian, but Prince Myshkin was what in Russian is called a holy fool or God's fool. So in a way, that's why he's called an idiot. Technically, he's called an idiot because, first of all, he had really severe epilepsy when he was a kid, so that he really was just kind of a slobbering idiot. He had such severe epileptic seizures that he was just kind of like in this daze, like throughout much of his childhood. And then he got sent to this clinic in the Swiss Alps, which is symbolic of like heaven, until, he's lived a very sheltered life, and he's very saintly. And he like forgives his enemies and so forth. So you've got these worldly, money-oriented people who call him an idiot, partly not because he had epilepsy as a kid, but because he's so innocent and naive and forgiving that from a worldly, cynical point of view, that's idiotic. And then later on, at the end of the novel, he really does go back to being the idiot who's just like in this daze and is nonverbal and doesn't recognize visitors and stuff. That's a spoiler. You might not want to listen to that part if you haven't read the novel yet. So, yeah, he's God's fool. He's not necessarily autistic. I don't know if in Dostoevsky's time there really was a concept of autism. And Prince Myshkin is largely based on Dostoevsky himself. Dostoevsky was no saint. He didn't have any illusions about being a saint. But Dostoevsky did have the same temporal lobe epilepsy that Prince Myshkin has. And so he sort of takes his own position kind of with the epilepsy, certain other character traits, and then tries to, make it Christ-like. That was the ambition of Dostoevsky in writing The Idiot. He wanted to portray a genuinely good human being. And at the time, he complained that really nobody had really tried that. I mean, Don Quixote was an attempt. Also, Pickwick in Charles Dickens' The Pickwick Papers. He's another attempt at a genuinely good person. Charles Dickens, I mean, his good guys like the Cheeryble brothers in Nicholas Nickleby. I mean, they're just like syrupy, sweet people. I mean, it's just sort of like this superficial, like stereotype, like a caricature of a good person. But Dostoevsky wanted to just portray at a deep level, just from top to bottom, just a sincerely, genuinely good person. And also at one or two levels of the novel, he also symbolizes Jesus Christ. So there might be some autism, just the author himself who was portraying him might technically have been on the spectrum. I mean, it wasn't severe autism, and that's not why Prince Myshkin is called an idiot in the novel. He's called an idiot in the novel because he was a holy fool, just so naive and trusting and forgiving and innocent that worldly, cynical people just considered him to be an idiot. And like men, especially like businessmen, would be mocking him behind his back, but really nobody could bring themselves to mock him to his face because he was such a genuinely good person. You couldn't help but have love for the guy. But then when he was gone, they'd be, mocking him, ridiculing him behind his back. At least the men would. The women are too soft-hearted, they still liked him. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to Skeladin or Skuladin's third question. And praise to Skeladin or Skuladin for not asking a fourth question here. And he says, was Nikola Tesla a mystic saint? And then the bullet points, he saw despair early on in life. He gained moral character after reading Abafi, son of Abba, at 8 years old, which places him at level 1, right between level 0, normal, materialist, spiritually illiterate, and level 2, intermediate, higher proof of spirit, but still not perfected. Let's see, from childhood onwards, has multiple out-of-body experiences, had a psychosomatic stress-induced debilitating illness that he cured by reading Mark Twain. That's a new one on me. How do you cure yourself of an illness from reading Mark Twain? He lived an ascetic forest life for a couple of years, gained a greater theoretical understanding of electrical engineering, even though he couldn't study in academia in those years. And there's more, but the first couple of chapters of Wizard, The Life and Times of Nikola Tesla. Okay, so the question again, was Nikola Tesla a mystic saint? And he may have had some mystical tendencies, but I don't think he was particularly saintly. I mean, he was kind of messed up in certain ways. He had like weird phobias and foibles, like something about the female neck, like women working in his laboratory, they had to keep their necks covered. They weren't allowed to wear jewelry just because this kind of stuff kind of bothered him. So I think Nikola Tesla, he was more of a mystic autist than a mystic saint. In some respects, he's more like J.F. Gariepi or even like Elon Musk, who Elon Musk admits to being somewhat autistic. They might have this inspiration, and there's a certain mysticism to creativity. It may be that a lot of his ideas, he had like the vision of the electrical generator thing. I don't remember exactly what it was. That came to him in a kind of vision that, there could be a certain amount of mysticism to it, but it was more of a kind of nutty, sort of borderline, sort of like the borderline between genius and just insanity. That would be my guess. I really don't know a whole heck of a lot about Nikola Tesla. About half of what I know about him comes from drunk history on YouTube. And speaking of YouTube, they've really cracked down on not having ad blockers so that I may even stop watching YouTube at all. If I can't watch YouTube without either paying money or watching commercials, which I loathe, then I'm just going to switch over to Rumble or something. So, yeah, Nikola Tesla may have had some mystical talent, but I don't consider him to be particularly saintly. You know, he was more like an inspired genius, but not especially saint. I mean, saintliness, like a saint would be a moral genius. You know, and yeah, I'm not so sure that Nikola Tesla was a moral genius. He may have been like a scientific genius, a mathematical genius, but a moral genius, I have never really studied up on his life, but the impression that I get was he was just a bit on the nutty side, which maybe was caused by being sort of a liminal being. You know, it's sort of like the autism or whatever kind of mental foibles he had, kind of had cracks in his mind that allowed the inspiration to shine through, that kind of thing. But I really am no authority on Nikola Tesla. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Cleefy. And Cleefy says, there is too much confusion about what is valid Buddha's teachings and what is made up. The question is, if I stick to 5 precepts and daily meditation on the breath, would it be a better option than worrying about which teachings are true and which ones are made up? And my woman and her mama have just pulled into the driveway, and so there may be some noise and commotion going on in the background in a minute or two. So I think I just interrupted myself very rudely, and so I'm going to finish my beverage here, and then crack open the emergency backup beverage. And then I'll ask this question again. From Cleefy. This is from Cleefy. Cleefy says, there is too much confusion about what is valid Buddhist teachings and what is made up. The question is, if I stick to 5 precepts and daily meditation on the breath, would it be a better option than worrying about which teachings are true and which ones are made up? However, I like Tibetan Buddhism. I like their colorful tradition, which many aspects of our mind represented by different Buddhas and bodhisattvas, and how to work on my mind with the help of those representations. On the other hand, Theravada seems like a rigid system, take it or leave it kind of attitude. As I said, it's confusing, and thanks to any karma letting me find you, it seems you are the best person to give a clear answer and help me to clear the confusion off my mind. Okay, so let's, I appreciate that. And let's get back to the top here. That's where the actual question is. So let's see. The question is, that's helpful. When he says the question is, you know the question's right after that. If I stick to 5 precepts and daily meditation on the breath, would it be a better option than worrying about which teachings are true and which ones are made up? Okay. Well, I mean, worrying itself is not a good idea. Just forget the worrying part. I mean, you can still seek, you can still search, you can still study. And really, there are some fairly good, guidelines you can follow if you want to know what the original Buddha originally taught. If that's not important to you, if you're just willing to accept whatever wisdom and you don't care if the Buddha really taught it, then the door is wide open. You can accept just about anything. But you have to be careful with regard to, there are 5 faculties in Theravada Buddhism, 5 indriyas. Also, they're called the 5 powers or strengths, the 5 balas. And that 2 of them are saddha, which is usually translated as faith, and panya, which is usually translated as wisdom, but here it's more like just intelligence. So it's sort of like faith and let's see, what's a good way of putting them in this dichotomy here? It's like faith and understanding, faith and intelligence, faith and reason. Yeah, there we go. Faith and reason. So you got to have a balance of faith and reason. Because if you have too much faith, you can believe anything no matter how ridiculous it is. And I mean, some New Age people come to mind when I say that. Well, if you have too much reason, then and not enough faith, then you're going to be a hardened skeptic. And even if you come across some golden nugget of wisdom, you may just reject it because of insufficient data or whatever. In the Visuddhimagga, Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga, which I've mentioned probably close to an hour ago now, maybe an hour ago or more, it says that a person with too much reason, not enough faith, is like a person who is sick and their sickness is caused by the medicine they take. So it's like your own reason is causing the problem. So let's get back up to the top here. The question is, if I stick to 5 precepts and daily meditation on the breath, would it be a better option than worrying about which teachings are true and which ones are made up? Well, I mean, some of the made up ones can be true. I mean, you can have some made up sutta or sutra in which the Buddha is still saying something wise, even though the historical Buddha didn't really say that. But I mean, there's a lot of things the historical Buddha didn't say that are still true. The historical Buddha never said Carson City is the capital of Nevada, even though Carson City actually is the capital of Nevada. So there's true things, even philosophical truths, that the historical Buddha didn't say that you can still, I mean, you shouldn't reject it just because the historical Buddha didn't say it. But I mean, if it depends on what your priorities are. If you really want, because you're a Buddhist, let's say because you're a Buddhist, you want to follow what the founder of the tradition originally taught. Like if you're a Christian, you want to follow what Jesus taught, not what Paul of Tarsus taught, not what some pope taught, not what some patriarch taught, but what Jesus himself taught. That would be the purest, truest Christianity, is following what was taught by the historical Jesus. And it's the same way with Buddhism. The purest Buddhism, presumably, would be what the historical Gautama Buddha, the original Buddha, actually taught. And so, I mean, it's impossible to be 100% sure. But, I mean, there are certain guidelines. I mean, like most Mahayana texts, I mean, it's not going to be what the original historical Buddha taught. It might be something that he would approve of, might be something that he would agree with. It might be like a paraphrase, saying in other words, something essentially like he taught, some of it. But still, I mean, if you really want to get as close to what the original Buddha taught, then you're better off going to the texts that are the closest to what the original Buddha taught, which nowadays, for the most part, are Pali texts. That's not to say that the Pali texts accurately, 100% accurately represent what the original Buddha taught, but you've got a higher percentage of authentic teachings to be found in the Pali texts. So at least, you know, you're increasing the percentage of what you consider to be the teachings of Buddha. But I mean, if that's not important to you, if you want to accept what you consider to be wise, what vibes with you, you know, what resonates with you, you know, you can read the Bhagavad Gita, some of it's very wise. You can read the Tao Te Ching, some of it's very wise. Some of the New Testament is very wise. The General Epistle of James has got a lot of wisdom to it. There's Kabir, whatever. Teachings of Ramana Maharshi, just whatever. That's fine. It all depends on really what you're going for. I mean, if you just want to suspend judgment like a classical skeptic and just practice, you can do that too. But it's hard not to have beliefs until you're enlightened. Even an enlightened being is going to have the semblance of beliefs. They might not cling to them or identify with them, but they're still going to be there. The cultural conditioning and stuff is still going to be there. So if you just stick to 5 precepts and daily meditation on the breath, yeah, that's fine. But still, you're going to have to think, you're going to have beliefs, and presumably you're going to have beliefs about Buddhism. And so you should be careful, or at least know what your priorities are. I mean, do you want to know what the historical Gautama Buddha really taught, or at least you want to get as close to that as you can? Then that's one thing. But I mean, if you just want to accept any kind of wisdom, anything that resonates with your heart or with your inmost self or whatever you want to call it, then I mean, that's a different approach you can take. And I mean, I kind of can appreciate both ways. I've gone both ways. It's just that when I'm in Buddhism mode, I really do want to get as close as I can to what the Buddha originally taught. But if I'm just in eclectic, I'm willing to accept wisdom from any source mode, then I can read the Tao Te Ching, the Zhuangzi, the Bhagavad Gita, the General Epistle of James, whatever, and that's all fine. I've read a lot of scriptures, even after becoming a Buddhist monk. I mean, great many scriptures I've read only after I became a Buddhist monk of other religions. And so it's good to be Bahusutta, as it's called in Pali, to have heard much, to be learned, to be well read, to be able to compare different traditions and know the good points and the strong points and the weak points and so forth. But I mean, it's just the worrying about it, which is, I mean, that's the stumbling block. Just reading the Bhagavad Gita or reading the Heart Sutra, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just when you start getting false ideas because of it, or just worrying, did the Buddha really teach the Heart Sutra, and just stewing over it, that's not going to be very helpful. In all likelihood, he didn't, although he may have approved of the message. I do think that the Buddha, the heart of what the Buddha taught, the essence of what he taught, is more in agreement with the Heart Sutra than with a lot of what you're going to find in the Pali texts. So it really depends on what your priorities are. I mean, if your priority is to know what the original historical Gautama Buddha taught, then there are ways of at least increasing the odds or increasing the percentage of genuine teachings in, within your field of view. You can dismiss certain things fairly easily, like Abhidhamma, for example, even within the Pali texts. So, the confusion part is really the kind of the stumbling block or the obstacle. And so, I mean, you can go either way, and it's all good so long as you're not stewing and like indecisive and worried and fretting and all that. But just looking and just seeking, just studying, that's all fine. And really, it depends on what your priority is to determine which way you should go. But I mean, you should balance faith and reason. Too much of one and you're out of balance. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Yutka. And Yutka says, let's see, what are your thoughts on this? In the Arya Pariyesana Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 26, the Buddha didn't want to talk about the enlightenment with anyone at first, but then came the god Brahma Sahampati and pleaded the Buddha to go and teach, and then the Buddha went out of compassion. If the Buddha was fully enlightened, I assume that he would have been more than willing to go and share his insight with others without having to be exhorted to do so. Well, this story is also found in the Vinaya Pitaka, the book of monastic discipline, the books of monastic discipline. Pretty sure it's in the Mahavaga. So I am familiar with it. And I guess he just wants my thoughts on it. Well, for starters, I do consider the story probably not to be authentic history, that it does kind of have the odor of religious propaganda. I mean, there's probably a kernel of truth. It may be that the Buddha really was hesitant to teach Dhamma because, according to this same story, he didn't think anyone was going to understand dependent co-arising, paticca samuppada. And I mean, that was a valid concern because it seems to me anyway, almost nobody really understands it, even though it was central to the Buddha's teaching. According to the text, Paticca is central to Dhamma, and still almost nobody really understands it. It ossified into the 12 link theory, the 12 nidana theory, and then people just memorize that and think that they understand it, and they don't. But the propaganda comes in where the Hindu personification of ultimate reality, or the proto-Hindu, the Vedic personification of ultimate reality, comes down and grovels before the Buddha. That's the propaganda part. Also, there are other suttas where you've got the Vedic personification of ultimate reality and the patron deity of the Indo-Aryans, Saka, king of gods, alias Indra, are like guarding the door to the Buddha's cabin. There's like one standing on one side, other standing on the other side, and they're reciting spontaneously these verses of praise, devotionalistic praise to the Buddha. Then that strikes me as just pretty intense religious propaganda, where they are like exalting the Buddha over the highest, most important deities in the Vedic pantheon and the proto-Hindu pantheon. So it may have been, though, that the Buddha really was hesitant to start teaching because he figured people just wouldn't understand the message. And if his original message was like the Atthakavagga, Theravada has pretty much forgotten the Atthakavagga. There's one text called the Mahanidesa, which is a canonical commentary on the Atthakavagga, which reinterprets the Atthakavagga into something relatively mundane. Like in the Atthakavagga where it says, the Buddha says, don't have any view. The Mahanidesa says, well, when he says don't have any view, what he means is don't have any wrong view. I mean, why even bother? Don't believe what's wrong. Why even say that? That should be obvious. You shouldn't go around having to tell people, don't believe what's false. So, and also in Theravada, there is the existence in Theravadan tradition of the Pacceka Buddha, which is like a hermit Buddha. He's a fully enlightened Buddha. He doesn't teach. He just goes off into the forest. And like in Zen Buddhism and so forth, there are enlightened sages who just live alone in the forest. They just don't want to be bothered. It's not really a matter of compassion, because compassion to some degree involves a certain amount of delusion, because there is no self. There really are no suffering beings ultimately. Conventionally, like in this virtual reality, they exist, but in ultimate reality, there are no suffering beings. And so there you got a being who's enlightened. They're just dwelling at the level of the absolute. Some of them just don't see any point in like re-entering the feverish dream to try to awaken these dream beings who are not ultimately real. Which kind of reminds me of Ramana Maharshi, where he had his awakening experience, and for, I think it was like at least 2 years afterwards, he was mute. It was like he hadn't worked out a way of like reconciling this new heightened awareness with just living in samsaric worldliness, using language, communicating with these normies, essentially. Not just normies, but virtual normies. So I guess I gave my thoughts on that. And I do think it's largely just a legend. I really have my doubts that Brahma Sahampati, the personification of ultimate reality, came down to earth and groveled to the Buddha to teach a tradition that would mock himself, Brahma Sahampati, or belittle him. It just strikes me as religious propaganda. And so I'm going to move on to the next question, which the person's name, I'm not so sure how to pronounce this. Lao Thunda, is that how to pronounce it? Is spelled L4OTHUND4. So if we say that 4 is an A, it would be Lao Thunda or Lao Tunda, something like that. Anyway, the person with 2 4s in his name says, I can't find anything in the Vinaya regarding the Sima and women going into the Uposatha hall and meditating or paying respects when there are no monks in there on days where the Sangha is doing official business. I thought they're not allowed inside, but some elder monks and some junior monks think it is, or think it's. Well, I actually wrote an essay on simas, or ecclesiastical boundaries, which is in this book, available on Amazon. Here, I'm doing some hype here. Essays in Theravada Buddhism. And on page 157, we've got technical matters, ecclesiastical precincts, or sima. And one of the things I mentioned in this is that the whole idea of simas, or nowadays a sima is considered to be like a meeting hall for the monks. It's like a congregation hall for the monks. That's not what sima means in Pali. Sima, it's like an ecclesiastical boundary. All the monks who live within the same sima are required to do their formal acts of the Sangha together. And the boundary markers of a sima can include a mountain or hill, a rock, a forest or grove of trees, a single tree, a path or road, a termite mound, a river or stream, or any body of water. So you can see here that some of the boundary markers for a sima are like a mountain, a forest, a river. And so it's fairly obvious just based on the sima. And if you want to read the original information on simas, I'm pretty sure it's in the Vinaya Mahavaga. But it's fairly clear that a sima was like, what is it called in Christianity? Like, I can't remember what it's called in Christianity, where you just got this area where, everybody goes to the same church. It's kind of an old-fashioned idea, but that's what a sima originally was. I mean, it's like the maximum dimensions of a sima is like something like 20 miles on a side. A sima cannot be so big that you can't walk to the meeting hall in that sima within one day. So originally, the sima was just the precinct. No, that's not it. It bugs me when I can't think of the word. It's an old-fashioned Christian word. Anyways, it's just, it could be like miles across the sima. It's just all the monks living in this area with well-demarcated boundaries, which can include mountains and forests. They all go to the same congregation hall, which doesn't even have to be a congregation hall. It's just like a specified place where the monks all meet. And then they do their formal acts of the Sangha together. And so, obviously, there can't be a rule against women being inside the sima, because it's going to be like an entire city can be the sima. It's called the Gama sima. That's one kind of sima where, especially if the city is an old-fashioned city with city walls, those walls can be the boundary of the sima. And then you can't just make all the women in the city leave when the monks want to do a meeting. So the whole idea has gotten corrupted. So now the ecclesiastical boundary is usually just slightly larger than this one congregation hall. But clearly the rules haven't changed since ancient times, so there really is no rule against women being inside the sima when monks are meeting. But there is a rule against anyone who is not fully ordained, which includes women, men, and like novices even, from being within arm's reach of the monks when they are doing a formal act. All the monks have to be within arm's reach of each other. They're kind of huddled together. But you can't have anyone who isn't a monk outside of that. And you can't have any monk farther than arm's reach, or that invalidates the formal act. So, what is the question here? I'm not sure if there's no question mark here. So, maybe we should continue with Lao Thunda's question here, because I haven't gotten to a question mark. The sima at the temple I go to has an artificial pond with the hall built atop the pond, and the pond is enclosed by a gated fence, and there is a perimeter of paver bricks laid down surrounding the fence. I saw a person temporarily ordained as a bhikkhu in honor of their father's death. However, there were people or relatives just outside the hall, not standing on the perimeter. Did they inadvertently validate the ordination? No, they didn't. Because I cringed when I bowed down to someone, but I did so out of respect for the triple gem. So, no, you can't have a rule. I mean, it's certainly not in the rules of monastic discipline that you can't have unordained people inside the boundaries of the sima, like during an ecclesiastical act, because as I say, a sima can be miles across, and I still can't think of the Christian term for it in English for parish. That's it. It's a parish. So it's just this entire area where all the monks living inside that entire area they all have to do their formal acts together. And this got degenerated, corrupted into something that is not in the Pali texts, where the sima just shrank down to this little formal boundary around this little congregation hall building. But the rules remain the same. So you can have women inside the sima. It might be against tradition in that culture for women to be inside the congregation hall during a formal act of the Sangha, but there's really no rule against it. It doesn't invalidate anything so long as they are not within arm's reach. And it could be a man who's within arm's reach if he's not ordained. So, I mean, if you want to read up on it, it's in this book. Also, it's in the Mahavaga of the Vinaya Pitaka if you want to get to the original source. So, let's see, here's some more. All these questions arose because some guy wanted to use some cinder blocks that were used to decorate or reinforce the gated fence, replace it with matching cinder blocks, and use the cinder blocks from the sima wall to make a tombstone or mausoleum for people's bones and ashes at this temple. I was told from others whatever is in the sima stays and can't be taken out, but yet the new abbot here said it's absolutely fine and that there was no harm to be done. I refused the abbot and did other chores at the temple. Who's in the wrong? Well, the abbot is correct, because the original meaning, according to the Pali rules of monastic discipline, is a sima is just a large area in which all the monks who live in that area have to do their formal acts together. And it can be miles across, with like a mountain demarcating one side of it and like a forest demarcating the other side of it. You need more than just two boundary markers, but still. And so, I mean, it is kind of against tradition. It's not against the rules, but it can be against tradition for there to be like women or lay people inside the congregation hall when monks are doing a formal act of the Sangha. Although like at an ordination, the new monk's mama might be watching, it may be okay. I mean, it's not against the rules, so long as she's not within arm's reach. But it depends on like the tradition of that area or that monastery. But really no rules are being broken other than maybe just local monastery rules. But it's not against Vinaya. So whatever is in the sima stays and can't be taken out. Well, a lot of things can be taken out. Like you put flowers on the altar, the flowers get old and wither up and dry out. You just throw them away outside the sima building. I mean, that's an obvious exception. So, yeah, it's just become very ritualized, and it has deviated quite a lot from the original meaning of the rules. And the original meaning of the rules was essentially a parish. It's just the area within which all the monks who live in that area have to congregate together at this designated place. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Joe Doe. And Joe Doe says, I've heard you talk about Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now. I forget what you said. Just quickly, do you like the book and is it worth reading? Yeah, I like the book and it is worth reading. He adopts kind of an unusual attitude or an unusual perspective on, the perennial philosophy, you can call it that, just sort of wisdom in general. He's got sort of as like Dhamma teachers who are considered to be enlightened beings, or who consider themselves to be enlightened beings, it's kind of a different angle. Some of what he says I don't really get, saying that women identify with their pain body. I mean, I've never heard that before. He's got some kind of strange ideas. All animals are fully enlightened except for a few domesticated pets who have like acquired neuroses from their owners, from their human owners, that kind of thing. But yeah, it's well worth reading. Definitely. You can definitely get benefit from reading that book, regardless of whether Eckhart Tolle really is enlightened or not. He obviously had some kind of awakening experience. At least he acquired like a heightened state of awareness. There was certainly a consciousness shift when he had his experience that just slammed him into this higher level of consciousness. So, I mean, you don't have to accept or reject anything that he read, but it's good to expose yourself to that kind of thing. So I'm just going to move on to Jodo's next question. Following up on my question about why Ajahn Chah suffered late in life, what I am struggling to understand is, how is it that the serial murderer gained nirvana after renouncing the world and his ways without making up all that bad karma first or after? Again, the story about the awakened monk that had to get beaten to a pulp, I don't know them by name, sorry. Surely he didn't have as bad karma as the serial murderer. And why did he have to make up that karma after enlightenment? Trying to wrap my head around it, because I think some say Ajahn Chah was an arhat. A lot of, especially people in Thai traditions, think Ajahn Chah was an arhat. Also Ajahn Mun, Ajahn Mahabua. Those would be like the big three in Thailand. There's a few others, Ajahn Lee Damadaro and so forth, that are considered to be, enlightened beings by a lot of people in Thailand or in Thai traditions. But yeah, the serial murderer was Angulimala. And even after he became enlightened, people were throwing rocks at him. I'm sure he got bloodied quite a few times. I don't remember how he died. He may have died like a painful death as a result of the karma that he committed or he generated when he was literally a serial killer. And Mahamoggallana was the chief disciple of the Buddha who was literally beaten to a pulp even after he was fully enlightened. But the thing is, when you become enlightened, or in order to become enlightened, you do not exhaust your karma. That's something that the Jains believed. The Buddhists did not accept that. The Buddha himself didn't have any use for that idea. The Jains would try to exhaust their karma, to use up all their karma, and then that would be like they'd become enlightened after they had exhausted all their karma. But in Buddhism, enlightenment and your karma are almost irrelevant. There's no direct correlation between them. So, you do try to make good karma so that you can have enough smooth sailing in your life, enough clarity of mind. You don't have like a shitstorm going on all the time, so you can cultivate Dhamma. You got good karma that helps you to cultivate Dhamma. And then from there, there's like this jumping off point. And it's at different stages for different people. Some people might have to attain fourth jhana before they can get to the jumping off point. Some people can jump off before they've attained jhana. It just depends on the person, like their talent, their personal qualities or whatever, their luck, random chance, I don't know. But, you don't exhaust your karma before you become enlightened, and you can have a lot of good karma and a lot of bad karma, and still you can make significant spiritual progress, whereas somebody else who doesn't have as much good karma or as much bad karma, it might be more difficult for them because of other reasons. So, some people, the bad karma is what slams you so hard that it just knocks you out of samsara. That's kind of like Eckhart Tolle's case. He was having this existential crisis where he was becoming he just couldn't stand it anymore. He was just at wit's end, and it just slammed him into this higher state of consciousness. Something very similar happened with Ramana Maharshi, who's going to come up in a later question here. So it's not that you have to use up your bad karma or get rid of your bad karma somehow in order to become enlightened. It can still be there if you've got enough good karma compensating so that you can still make progress. You can still hear, the enlightened teacher speaking to you. Angulimala must have had some really good karma also. I think it's Richard Gombrich wrote a book. Let's see, How Buddhism Began, the conditioned genesis of the early teachings. One chapter was about Angulimala, and he has this hypothesis that Angulimala, who is portrayed as just a serial killer, may have been like a devotee of Kali, who may have still been a serial killer, but at least he had like this yearning for some kind of, divine awakening or something. He was just going about it in the wrong way, but he had some kind of momentum going from a past life, this spiritual momentum, and just taking this really wrong turn may have just slammed his momentum the other direction when he met the Buddha. I mean, there's all kinds. It can take all kinds of weird stories. There's all kinds of different people can have these awakening experiences. So, yeah, I don't think that Angulimala being a serial killer and then becoming enlightened, I mean, I do think that he met with a lot of violence because people knew who he was. People were like throwing rocks at him because he killed their Uncle Joe or whatever. But yeah, I don't know how he died. I think he might have died a violent death too. But it didn't matter so much because he was enlightened. He had laid down the burden. He did what had to be done. So yeah, it's not like the Jains believe that you have to use up all of your karma, even your good karma, all good and bad. You just exhaust your karma and then you don't have any more sticky karma sticking to your jiva, and then you just float up into heaven. And that's essentially what the Jains believe. But in the Buddhist, samsara is kind of irrelevant. It's like you can bail out of samsara at pretty much any stage. It's just that the more advanced you get, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to get the insight that allows you to just bail out. It's not like you go up, 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 up until you reach Nibbana. It's like you just go up this endless ladder, up, 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 with no end to it, until finally you just bail out sideways. So I kind of sort of answered that question, and I'm moving on to the next one. This is from R.P. Brothers. And R.P. Brothers says, "Hey, can you levitate? I was told levitation is possible. I used to try to levitate. Like when I was in Burma, I would like jump up and try not to fall back down again. I fell back down every single time. I also used to try to wave my hand through like solid rock, and it didn't work either. I kept hitting the thing, like tried to wave my hand through a post or something, and it just kept hitting until finally I just developed this defeatist attitude where I was like trying to be careful not to hurt my hand when it hit, which of course that means you don't have the faith of a grain of mustard seed. But in my dreams, yeah, I've had a lot of flying dreams or levitating dreams. But in my conscious waking state, I do not have a whole lot of psychic talent. My father was more psychic than me, or at least he was more intuitive than me. Maybe a little more liminal than me. Although I guess I'm liminal in other ways. So I have tried to levitate, and somebody in the comments made this semi-joke answer that there was a photograph of me levitating over the city of Monua in Burma, and I heard that there was this picture going around of me levitating over the city of Monua, and I would just say, well, it must be somebody else because I don't remember doing that. But the Burmese are a friend of mine also was seen levitating, even though he didn't remember levitating either. So you can get legends about you pretty easy living in a place like Burma or India. But yeah, I tried to levitate and it just didn't really succeed. I couldn't levitate for more than about 1 second. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from 5 Precept Paul, formerly known as 5 Precept Pete. And his first question is, have you read Whisper in the Heart, The Ongoing Presence of Neem Karoli Baba? And no, I haven't, but it sounds like an interesting book. I wouldn't mind reading it if I had it. Maybe I'll order it or something. I have read Miracle of Love, stories about Neem Karoli Baba. which and I've got his picture up there on top of the bookcase, on the closest thing I've got to an altar. So yeah, the correct answer to this question is no, I have not read Whisper in the Heart, The Ongoing Presence of Neem Karoli Baba, but it sounds like an interesting book, an inspiring book too. So anyways, 5 Precept Pete, Paul, formerly known as 5 Precept Pete, says, assuming all the manifestations and miracles of Neem Karoli Baba are true, wouldn't that still not explain how he is appearing to people after his death? Well, we don't know what state he is in now, because even in Miracle of Love, stories about Neem Karoli Baba, there were several stories about him manifesting after he died, sometimes as other people, but with the same mannerisms as Neem Karoli Baba. You know, it's like he would just appear as like a little kid or some old sadhu or something. And, you know, it could just be the imagination of the devotee who is so, you know, firmly directed towards Neem Karoli Baba. They would see him and other people. But in a way, it kind of reminds me of in the New Testament, you know, the disciples, the apostles on the road to Emmaus, and they meet Jesus and they don't recognize it. You know, it's just, he looks like somebody else apparently. So was it really Jesus, or was it just somebody else that later they thought, oh, that must have been Jesus, because he acted like Jesus did. So let's get back to the question though. Assuming all the manifestations and miracles of Neem Karoli Baba are true, wouldn't that still not explain how he is appearing to people after his death? Well, Neem Karoli Baba just did not follow rules. That's one of the reasons why I just resonated with Neem Karoli Baba. He was like an enlightened rascal, and he did not follow rules. It's like there's a story in Miracle of Love where Ram Dass is talking to a physicist, and he's, you know, talking about the miracles of Neem Karoli Baba, and the physicist is an open-minded physicist, and so he's accepting the possibility that Neem Karoli Baba can read minds and do these psychic feats. And then Ram Dass says also he can appear in more than one place simultaneously. And then the physicist kind of backs off from that and says, well, that's impossible. And then Ram Dass says, yeah, it may be impossible, but he did it anyway. And that's just kind of the way Neem Karoli Baba was. I mean, he just broke rules. So, I mean, there's no telling what he did. I mean, he could be some sort of, I mean, assuming that he wasn't even fully enlightened, he could still be some sort of deity who can just continue appearing. Or, I mean, he could be enlightened and just be breaking the rules about what's supposed to happen to enlightened people. It's hard to say. So, this is like another question that's tacked on to the question above that I've already been responding to. Wouldn't he have taken rebirth elsewhere or enter parinibbana? Well, he could take rebirth as assuming that he did take rebirth, he could take rebirth as some being in some higher dimension that can still manifest however he pleases in this version of samsara. I mean, that's presumably possible. But trying to second guess somebody like Neem Karoli Baba is a fool's errand. It's just an exercise in futility. And so I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Sampapalapa. And Sampapalapa says, what kind of exercises are allowed as a monk? Would push-ups, jogging, and sit-ups be allowed, or just walking meditation? I can imagine that making your muscles bigger and having a six-pack would be seen as sensual. I read through the 227 rules of the order, so I'm going to guess no on building muscle, but I'm still asking because I don't really know. So, getting back to the question, which is right here at the top, what kind of exercises are allowed as a monk? Well, there are two main kinds of exercises that are specifically promoted in the text. One, walking, doing a lot of walking meditation, or just, walking to the village. I mean, sometimes a monk will live in a forest. It could be 2 miles or more to the nearest village. I've heard of places that were like 7 miles away. So you'd be walking, 15 miles a day, just going for food and walking through the village and coming back again. So a lot of walking, that's good for your health. It's good for the cardiovascular system and so forth. And then the other kind of exercise that is specifically allowed in the text is just doing chores around the monastery, chop wood, carry water, that kind of thing. So with regard to the examples Sampapalapa gives, push-ups, jogging, and sit-ups. Well, jogging, let's just say a jogging monk would look inappropriate in a Buddhist culture, and it would not inspire respect or reverence in a non-Buddhist culture. You got the monk with jogging. I mean, jogging shoes would be out. He'd be out jogging in flip-flops or barefoot, and just he'd look silly, and people would be laughing at him in a non-Buddhist culture. And in a Buddhist culture, people might be like clucking their tongues and shaking their head and thinking these barbarian monks, they just don't know how to act properly. So jogging would be out. Swimming would be out because there's specifically a rule. A monk is not allowed to play in water. He's only allowed to swim if he's got a genuine reason, like it's the only way to cross a river. He's trying to get away from like a charging water buffalo or something. Charging elephant maybe. Then you can jump into the water and swim. But swimming for exercise is, maybe if it's like prescribed by a doctor, it's definitely for health reasons. You might be able to get away with it. Push-ups and sit-ups, if you did it in privacy for health reasons, but it's really not necessary. Going with the early Buddhist texts, if you're walking a few miles a day and you chop wood, carry water kind of stuff, you're filling your 5-gallon bucket with water at the well, and you got to pull the rope to fill the bucket, and then you're carrying it on your shoulder. You're walking a quarter mile to your cave or your hut or whatever. That's fairly good meditation. When I was a monk, I wasn't doing any kind of special meditation, but I was in decent good shape. Just from, first of all, just living a rough existence. It kind of brings out the caveman instincts and maybe boosts your testosterone or something just from living a rough existence. And then, all the walking and, fetching bucket after bucket of water and just fill the big 10-gallon can to take a bath and, carry another 5 gallons up on my shoulder, back up the hill, back to my cave, that kind of thing. I was in good shape. You could do like yoga stretches and so forth, I suppose. But what would be the purpose of it? If it's to help you to stay limber so you can sit in the full lotus for an hour or more, then that would be a dharmic reason. But you just want your body to be a well-honed machine that, you just want to be able to look at yourself in the mirror and with admiration, then no, that would not be a good excuse. And it's furthermore, looking into a mirror is against Vinaya anyway. So yeah, I think you'd probably be best as a monk just doing a lot of walking meditation and some of that chop wood, carry water stuff. And if that's not enough, you've got to kind of examine your motives. Why do you want to do push-ups? Why do you want big biceps or well-developed pectoral muscles or a six-pack or anything like that? And it's like, how does that help you to practice Dhamma? Maybe if you got a doctor prescribing it for some sort of condition, maybe then, but otherwise I think you're just better off with walking, chopping wood, and carrying water. So I'm just going to move on to Sampapalapa's next question, and specifying that my answer to the first question was specifically with regard to monks. Lay people, you can do as you please. So anyways, Sampapalapa's second question here. Since everything is mind-made and we are all a part of this beautifully cruel game based on karma and our defilements, aren't we able to kind of read each other's minds to some degree by having awareness of mine and others' bodily speech and mind? An example is someone's smiling at you, but you know that it's fake, and someone else smiles at you and you know it's genuine. I know it can't always be true at all times, and ultimately, aren't I just projecting that based on a wrong perception or just perception and then conceptions in general? It's not hard to see, and social psychology or whatever psychology that handles this seems to have a good understanding of how to see it and the deep mental states that accompany these actions, but it seems like Buddhism might take it a little further or deeper, but I'm not all the way certain. So let's get back up to the main question here. Aren't we able to kind of read each other's minds to some degree by having awareness of mine and others' bodily speech and mind? Well, even even animals can do that. I think part of the situation here is it reminds me of a book called Seth Speaks by Jane Roberts, who is channeling this multi-dimensional entity called Seth. And Seth says, you always know if you're being lied to. You always know if you're being ripped off. You always know what the other person's motives are. That everyone has like this communal, like telepathic mind. But you don't have full conscious access to this level of your own mind because most of us are stuck in the ego. This ego isn't your entire mind. The ego is like this self-referential part of your consciousness that is pretty much oblivious to anything beyond it because it thinks that has its own existence separate from everything else. So your ego is oblivious to like your subconscious mind where this telepathic ability exists. And so it's not so much a matter of some like adept swami who cultivates telepathy that creates the ability to be telepathic. It's just that he acquires access to that level of his mind that is already telepathic. But we've all got it. It's just that most of us are completely contained in this mental prison of our ego, and we're unaware of all this other consciousness around it that we have. I mean, we should have access to if our ego wasn't all closed off against it. So maybe an animal doesn't have as much of an ego. Presumably animals don't. And so they're more able to read minds or read people's true intentions, you know, like a dog proverbially can tell just whether a person approaching him is friend or enemy. You know, they can sort of see through the fake smile, see through the con man spiel. You know, they can tell better than a lot of people can whether someone is really a friend or an enemy. Also, my father used to be a big game hunter in Alaska, and he said that sneaking up on a moose is damn near impossible. Like if you're out moose hunting, I'm not recommending that you all go out moose hunting here, but if you go moose hunting, sneaking up on a moose is damn near impossible. The moose will always get spooked and run off. But if you sneak up on a tree next to the moose, you know, you're just concentrating on that tree next to the moose, sneaking up on that tree, it's as easy as shooting cows. My father kind of had a magical attitude towards things. He was sort of a pagan type. But I mean, that could be an example. I mean, Stone Age people, they just accepted it as fact that animals can read minds. That's one of the hypotheses for how meditation was invented. You know, somebody had to invent meditation. One possibility is that it was Stone Age hunting magic, where people firmly believed animals can read minds. And so if you're lying in ambush with your spear or your addle or whatever, then you try to not think. You know, you just try to keep your mind empty while you're lying in wait for the animal to go by. So, I mean, there is that. Also, they have done studies where there is a significant ability in humans to know when someone is staring at them, like behind them. That we do have like this subliminal ability to do this kind of stuff. I don't know if they've figured out exactly how we do it, but we do seem to have, you know, above random chance ability to know when someone is staring at us from like behind us somewhere. So we do have access to this kind of a group mind, but because we're locked into our ego and think that our ego is who we are, then in a way we blind ourselves to all this other stuff that we should have access to, but deny ourselves access to it. And I hope I answered that question, because I'm moving on to the next one. And this is from Rui. And Rui says, "Hello, Panyo. Would you care to elaborate on the utterance of another as a requirement for right view, as well as on the qualities of that other that should be clearly apparent?" And I do vaguely recall that there is like a sutta saying in order to have right view, one of the prerequisites for right view is the utterance of another. But I mean, it never really made an impression on me. And the utterance of another is very sporadic in its reliability. You know, the utterance of another is not necessarily going to get your right view. It could go the other direction. So I assume the implication is the utterance of another is the utterance of a wise being. You know, like a Buddha, some sort of very wise being. But if you're just a normie, it's hard to tell who is wise and who isn't wise because you can't really understand something greater than yourself. So you're going to see everyone pretty much at your own level. And it never really resonated with me that in order to have right view, you have to have the utterance of another. It may be going with the Buddhist idea that only a Buddha can come up with Dhamma on his own. That in order to learn Dhamma, if you're not a Buddha, you're going to have to get it from somebody else. So that could be what it's referring to here. I don't recall the context, but that would seem to be a logical consequence of Dharma. You know, if a Sama Sambuddha is the only person who can really comprehend Dhamma on his own without it being taught to him, then all the rest of us are going to have to learn it from somebody else. So that is probably what it's referring to as the utterance of another, someone who can teach you Dhamma. So I guess I answered the question, didn't I? The qualities of that other, I guess they would have to really understand Dhamma in order to teach it to somebody else. And nowadays, it's not even necessarily the utterance of another so much as you can read a book. I mean, some of my most important teachers have been books. So, I mean, the book itself is not conscious. So the book itself is not wise. It's neither wise nor foolish. It's just like this, paper and ink. So it's just, you need to hear the right words that can trigger the insight, which reminds me of, there was some Zen monk who wasn't enlightened. He's walking through the marketplace and he's walking past a butcher shop. And there's this lady there saying to the butcher, "Give me the best cut of meat you've got." And the butcher says, "Every cut of meat in my shop is the best cut of meat." And somehow that triggered an insight in this monk, and he had an awakening experience. So that was the utterance of another, although, of course, he had experienced previous utterances that were more along dharmic lines that set him up so that he was ripe for this random comment from a butcher to just be the last little nudge that sent him over the edge. But I do think probably what it's referring to is that since only a Buddha can learn Dhamma completely without a teacher, then everyone else has to have a teacher. And nowadays it can be a book, it can be a YouTube video, it can be a podcast. Preferably it'd be like a really wise teacher, generally a monk, but not necessarily. And so I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from GameFap. And GameFap says, living in the state of South Carolina, how often do you come across Confederate iconography? Like this shirt. Look at that. What is the general public sentiment of the state's Confederate heritage? It's kind of silly that all of a sudden these memorials became a problem when for 100 years no one cared, not even Martin Luther King. Our culture looks for scapegoats instead of fixing real problems. Well, every once in a while, there's like one house on like a state highway just a few miles out of town. They have got a huge Confederate flag flying over their house. And every once in a while, you'll see a Confederate flag on like draped from someone's front porch or something. And they don't catch a lot of flack from it. It's just seen as kind of sort of Southern heritage. Nobody is thinking, I support slavery. That's why. It's like, they think of the more positive aspects of like state rights, that kind of thing, when they think about, the Confederacy. Like my father was from Georgia. And when he was kid, there were still people alive who had fought in the Civil War, so that when he was a little kid, grown-ups were telling him that his belly button was where the Yankee shot him. And my father used to say that to me too. That's where the Yankee shot you. But I mean, from the Southern point of view, they would kind of switch it over. I mean, the Civil War wasn't about slavery. It was about states' rights. You know, are we going to have like a loose confederation of states, or are we going to have like a centralized federal government that's going to be the most important? Although I think slavery was a major part of the Civil War. Like, I read the autobiography of John Stuart Mill, who used to be in the Guinness Book of World Records as one of the people that was estimated to have one of the highest IQs of any person in history. He was a politician. He was in England, but I mean, he was a politician, extremely intelligent. And in his autobiography, you know, he lived during the time of the Civil War, and he said it was pretty obviously about slavery. So I don't think that there are very many people who fly Confederate flags or have Confederate bumper stickers on their pickup trucks. Generally, it's more likely to be a pickup truck than a car that has a Confederate flag bumper sticker on it. There is a store just north of Greenville called Dixie Republic, which is where I got my shirt. I like Corinthian helmets too. And also it says Mulon Labe, you know, come and get it, which is with reference to the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Yeah, they've got lots of Confederate paraphernalia there, a lot of portraits of Confederate generals and so forth. South Carolina, it's like there's all kinds of streets and parks, and I think there's one county, there's schools named after Wade Hampton. And if you read the biography of Wade Hampton, man, that guy, I mean, he was a high-ranking officer in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. Before that, he used to go bear hunting without a gun. He would just sick his dogs on a bear and then just jump on it with a knife and stab it to death. This guy. And, I mean, he was, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, he had this group of, or it wasn't really his organization. It wasn't kind of like the German SA with Hitler. It was this other group called the Red Shirts. They were like vigilantes that just endorsed him to be the governor of South Carolina. And they did some terrorism kind of stuff, you know, scaring people into either voting for him or not voting at all, that kind of thing. The election was very irregular, so that you had two governors at the same time, you had the governor and the anti-governor, like two different governments trying to govern South Carolina. It became clear that most people were on the side of Wade Hampton, and so the other guy was kind of, you know, advised by the president of the United States he'd better just like give it up and resign or something. But you know, there's a lot of Confederate heritage in the South, and most people, I mean, they don't really think about slavery. It's just sort of like a national or, you know, Southern pride kind of a thing. You know, we stood up to the assholes in Washington, D.C., that kind of thing. We've got our own heritage here. So I forgot the question though. Let's see, living in the state of South Carolina, how often do you come across Confederate iconography? Yeah, well, you drive past Dixie Republic, which is this store that sells all this Confederate stuff, also other Southern stuff. They got all these flags, including a big Confederate flag out front. Unfortunately, though, I was going to buy an American flag there. It turns out all their flags are made in China. Who wants to buy an American flag made in China? I don't. I did get the shirt, though. I don't think the shirt was made in China. So, yeah, actually, it reminds me, a few months ago, there was I work at a sheet metal shop, and a customer came in to pick up some like roofing panels, and he had a Confederate flag on the company truck. You know, it wasn't just this privately owned pickup truck. It was, you know, this organization. It turns out that they were an organization. They had a kind of a valid excuse. They like renovated or like restored historical buildings. And so he had a Confederate flag on the back of his pickup truck, this customer. And also the the factory manager was very impressed. Yeah, actually, had an SS skull ring. If I remember correctly, he also had like a braided beard. He was a badass looking guy, but he kind of had the excuse for the Confederate flag on the company truck, just because they restored historical buildings, which would include, Confederate era buildings, I suppose. And so it does happen. It's not super common, but it's not super rare either that you'll see a Confederate flag either flying over somebody's house or draped from their balcony or stuck onto the side of their car or something. Not super rare. But it's really, they're not thinking about slavery when they're doing it. They're just thinking about like Southern pride, Southern individuality, so to speak. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Twin Wasabi. And Twin Wasabi says, would you ever talk to Sam Shamoun? He is a YouTuber who does religious discussions, but I don't think he's ever talked with a Buddhist monk before. I've never heard of Sam Shamoun. I'd be willing to talk to him. Really, I'm willing to talk to just about anybody. If there's any YouTuber who wants me to be interviewed on their show or something, as a general rule, I say, okay. I don't go out searching for people to interview usually. My woman is always wanting me to like reach out to this person or that person, see if they want to be interviewed, but I'm just kind of standoffish in that respect. But if somebody asks me, usually I will say yes. Even they could just be small time, they got 35 subscribers or something. It doesn't really matter to me. So, I mean, if he wanted me to be on a show, there's a good chance I'd go for it. As long as it's in good faith, then I'd be willing to go for it. So, but I don't know who he is. So I'm just going to go on to the next question here. This is from Romeo. Romeo says, my two questions require you to don a guidance counselor fez if you own one. So just a second. People haven't been asking Majamaka questions lately, so the fez hasn't been getting much use. It's kind of acquiring a little bit of dust, actually. Let's see here. All right. See, my two questions require you to don a guidance counselor fez. Okay, check. My beloved niece, a junior in high school, is soon going to take the SATs and begin looking into colleges. While not totally discouraging her, I have urged her to think twice about going to college, considering the exorbitant costs, available alternatives like remote online learning, and widespread leftist indoctrination. Do you see going to college as still necessary to better one's life in 2024? Well, no, it's not necessary. Yeah, it's certainly not necessary to better your life. And really, considering how most universities have just become like leftist indoctrination centers, then, I mean, there would be that definite disadvantage to going, because there's a good chance she would just come out brainwashed. I mean, I really liked going to college. I was sort of a hot shot in college. I was like a brain jock, and had a lot of fun in college. Like the university I went to had lots more girls than boys going there. Or I should say more women than men. Young women than young men. Had a lot of fun in college. It was some of the most fun I ever had in my life was in college. But yeah, it's a bit different nowadays. Like the same university I went to, I mean, it's just become just like shrieking leftist hysteria at this point. For example, if Trump wins a second term, no doubt there's going to be like therapy sessions offered for free by the university clinic and all this stuff for people who are just freaked out because we've got a fascist as president again. He's gonna destroy the Constitution, even though it's mainly the left that doesn't like the Constitution. So the answer to this question is fairly simple. It's not necessary to better one's life. You know, it can better one's life, but not nearly to the same degree as in the past, because we are living in the information age. I mean, you can learn just about anything you want to learn online, for example. It's like the internet is like a seventh sense. The sense organ is the computer, and the internet, I mean, it's like you have this clairvoyant eye. You can just have access to the world's knowledge at your fingertips. So let's see. Let's just move on to the second question. Romeo's second question. Considering the high probability of AI replacing many currently existing jobs during her lifetime, which field of employment do you suggest someone my niece's age pursue? And that's a very difficult question because I don't know your niece. Different people are going to have different talents, different interests, and so on. But I mean, with regard to AI, I think it's fairly obvious that AI is going to pretty much abolish most artist jobs. It may abolish most musician jobs, at least like recorded music. There might still be some call for live musicians, but most of the music probably is going to be composed by AI. Like mathematician, forget about it. I think certain professions are less likely to be taken over by AI, especially like any kind of interpersonal interaction kind of a job. Like there's always going to be doctors, even though it may be that an AI program is diagnosing your symptoms, you're still going to have a doctor who's like, asking you questions, like looking you over, sitting down, having a talk with you. Still going to have nurses, I assume. I don't think they're going to have robots that are like, taking people's blood pressure and so forth. I mean, to some degree it's automated, but you're still going to have the nurse put the cuff on your arm or something. But still, I really don't know the daughter or the niece at all. So I'm not sure what her talents, what her inclinations would be. So it would have to be, something that you like and are good at. I mean, any kind of profession, you want to be successful and happy in a profession. I mean, there's a few things. I mean, you have to like what you're doing. You have to be good at what you're doing, and you have to be able to make money by doing it. I mean, those are like the three big things. And so, I mean, AI will influence the third one, but still, it depends on the individual, what it is that they like and what it is that they're good at. And with regard to your niece, I have no idea what that would be. Although, as I say, most art is going to be computer generated. I mean, already, like most of my the thumbnails on my videos now are AI generated. Music probably, it's really taken off. Poetry even, although poetry is pretty much of an obsolete art form. Yeah, and math definitely. So, yeah, some of the more human stuff, but I mean, you definitely don't want liberal arts degrees, because then you're definitely going to come out some brainwashed leftist, some neo-Marxist. Although I did read recently that a lot of people in northern states are sending their kids to southern states to get a university education, because southern states like in Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina are more conservative and traditional, and the universities might still be hotbeds of leftist activism, but not nearly as much as in some place like New York or Massachusetts. Also, there are just some universities, and I would advise my niece to choose one of these, that there's like an emphasis on freedom of thought and expression. University of Chicago, for example, or like Hillsdale College, which, I mean, a lot of these places, they offer courses online anyway, which kind of deprives you of the fun of being on a university campus. But university campuses probably aren't nearly as much fun now. And the fun that is to be had is probably of more of a degenerate nature than like even when I was going to college in the 80s, the mid to late 80s, mid 80s, let's say, it's like you got young women who are away from their father's watchful eye for the first time in their lives, and they just go hog wild. But nowadays, I mean, there's such a thing as too much of a good thing. I mean, they're just extreme at this point. And also, of course, you go to a drunken party, you're drunk, the girl's drunk, and then you hook up with her. And then, 3 months later, she's persuaded by some foaming at the mouth feminist that she was like taken advantage of because she was in a suggestive state because she was drunk. I mean, you can have your life ruined for rape. It's like both of you are equally drunk, but I mean, you're still a moral agent, even if she is too inebriated to be one somehow. There have been multiple cases of that sort of thing. Although I'm completely digressed from the question. So, yeah, I would advise her that, I mean, she's going to have to decide for herself what her interests are, what she's good at, and try to, steer her away from stuff that's going to be taken over by AI, like art, for example, unless she can find a niche, be a potter. Some pottery, I assume, isn't going to be completely taken over by AI, even though painting probably will, drawing probably will. But find a university that still has some traditional values, that isn't just like a Marxist indoctrination camp. That would be one of the most important things if she does go to a university. And of course, you can do courses online now, so that will spare you from a lot of it. So I think I answered Romeo's questions. So I'll take the fez back off and move on to the next question, which is from Priapistic Monk. And Priapistic Monk says, how well does the following song align with your concept of Theravada Buddhism? And he's got the link to this YouTube video, which I almost couldn't watch because, as I have said, YouTube is really cracking down on not allowing ad blockers. And I just refuse to watch commercials on YouTube. So, I mean, I had to refresh a few times in order to finally be able to watch it. And it's called Fake. I think maybe the band or the composer is called That Handsome Devil. And it's like the refrain in this song, it's like rap. So I actually listened to some kind of rap music. This is a distraction from what is really happening. And it's talking about how everything in your life is fake. The boobs are fake, the lips are fake, the smiles are fake. It's all fake. Everything is fake, which kind of reminds me of Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye, who was like obsessed with phony people everywhere. He just couldn't stand it, even though he himself was a phony person. He was lying all the time, just coming up with all this bullshit he was telling people. And The Catcher in the Rye is a crypto-Buddhist story. It's more Mahayana than Theravada, though. So, let's see, where's the question again? How well does the following song align with my concept of Theravada Buddhism? Well, I mean, it's saying that, everything is fake, or at least, it's just listing off, thing after thing after thing that's all fake, with the refrain being, this is a distraction from what is really happening. But, I mean, what is really happening is fake too. So, I mean, that would be the main difference here between the song and Theravada Buddhism, is that the song is kind of implying that we're living in an artificial fake world but really it's like a distraction from the real world that we should be paying attention to. And the real world is still samsaric. Whereas, I mean, in Theravada, if you're like an Abhidhamma scholar or something, you could say that's sort of true, that samsara is ultimately real according to the Abhidhamma philosophy, or at least according to the Abhidhamma commentaries. But my understanding is, it's all just conventional truth. So in a sense, no matter how deep down you go in samsara, it's all going to stay fake, or just like conventional, like provisional, conditional, like, what's the other word? Virtual, potential. It's not ultimately real. So, I mean, you can reduce the amount of fakeness by just like going off into a forest where there's no like human artificial bullshit that's being thrust upon you. But it's still, you've got your own perceptions which are generating illusions, and you believe the illusions, which turns it into delusion. So, Yeah, I mean, there are certainly themes that that sort of overlap between this song or rap. I guess you'd call it rap a song, even though nobody's actually singing, and Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism. But I think Theravada Buddhism goes a bit deeper than the song does, which is to be expected because it's just a song. So I think I answered that. And so I'm moving on to the next question, which is from Pyramid. And Pyramid says, one of the main rules in Buddhism is not to compare yourself to others. It sounds logical, but this is very hard to do in the modern age. Sports, for example, is literally all about comparing yourself to others who ran the fastest, who scored the most points, who had the best performance. The award shows, the Oscars, Grammys, etc., are also about comparing yourself. What advice do you have to those who want to remove or at least minimize the comparisons that we inevitably make? And personally, I've never been really a competitive person. If I compete, it's like with myself. I try to do better than I've done before. So it's still kind of, I'm comparing myself to myself, which is still mana. The word usually for translated as conceit, sometimes pride, is mana in Pali. And literally mana means measuring. So you're measuring yourself up. That's mana, that's conceit, or sometimes translated as pride. Like mana jide, he's got big mana in Burmese, means he's proud, he's a stuck-up person. So, yeah, it's in the Atthakavagga it says, to consider yourself superior to others is conceit. To consider yourself inferior to others is conceit. To consider yourself equal to others is conceit. And so just comparing yourself to somebody else in any way is conceit. I mean, just to have self-regard is conceit. It's something that a Buddhist shouldn't have. So if you want to get away from that, I mean, first of all, get away from competitive environments. You know, I mean, you can be sort of like Prince Myshkin in The Idiot, where people are competing against you and you just don't see it. You know, you're not competing back, which means you're going to get people backstabbing you to get the promotion so that you don't get the promotion, that sort of thing. Also, I mean, there was a guy that I used to work with that he was a young man, and he was kind of a masculine kind of guy. He worked out, and he was pretty well built kind of a young guy. And I kept getting the impression that he was like competing with me. And I was told when I was in the university that there was this guy who was competing with me, and I just didn't get it. It's like, why? You know, I mean, in the case of the guy who was working with me, then, you know, he wanted to get promoted, you know, better than me. You know, I was kind of seen as a rival or something, I assume. But yeah, I just don't think that way. So, I mean, one way is you just don't think that way. Well, although if you tend to think that way, then one of the best things you do, first of all, get away from competitive environments. And even better yet, you can become a hermit. You can become a recluse. And then you're not competing with anybody. Maybe, you know, competing with animals, competing with yourself. But it's more of a competition is more of a mental state than you know, it's something that you necessarily have to partake in. You know, it's like an attitude. But other people can be competitive with you, and you don't have to be competitive back, which may mean that you're not going to get promoted as much as the competitive guy, which is one reason why men can make more money than women, even though now the laws are kind of, and also the DEI initiatives and everything are geared towards women making at least as much money as men. A lot of women make more money than men just because they're women. But women just aren't as competitive as men, so they have to, like, you know, rig the game in women's favor just so that they can sort of compete without having to really compete. But I'm like straying away from the question again. You know, how not to compare yourself to others? I mean, the traditional Buddhist way is you go off alone into a forest and just stop interacting. You opt out of society. I mean, that would be the traditional Buddhist way of going about it. Otherwise, you just have to adopt a non-competitive like attitude. Just do the best you can without worrying about what anybody else does. And it is doable. I mean, I generally tend to be that way. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Drunk Druck. And Drunk Druck says, have you heard of the phenomenon called the hum? It is a loud, unexplainable noise that people have reported hearing across the world. Maybe this is the power of the Buddha's meditation reverberating throughout the centuries. No, I've never heard of the hum. And that's the question right there. So I guess I could just leave it at that. Nope, I've never heard of the hum. Although I kind of doubt that it is the Buddha's meditation reverberating throughout the centuries. Although it does remind me of a story in one of Ram Dass's books, how he had been taught a mantra by one of his teachers in India. And he was doing this mantra until suddenly he just kind of locked into this. It was as though the Mormon Tabernacle Choir was all doing the same mantra with him. It was just like reverberating, just thousands and thousands of voices all doing the same mantra. And so he told his teacher about it, and he says, you got into the frequency of that mantra so that, you were kind of tuned into all the other beings, especially the more advanced ones who were doing that, who had done that mantra. They just kind of created this Akashic record of the mantra going on. So that might be more along the lines of the reverberations of the Buddha's meditation would be, you'd have to get to that level. It's not going to be just some ordinary physical level that ordinary normies are going to hear. But yeah, the correct answer, the short answer is nope, I've never heard of it. And so I'm going to move on to the next question here. This is from Power. And Power says, ever notice so many atheists are bitter and angry? Ever have any atheists rage and mock you because they think they are superior than you? Why be so angry at something that you think is not real? For example, I'm not angry at Bigfoot because I don't think it's real, so I don't waste my time. Well, atheists do think that people who aren't atheists are real. So they're not angry at God so much as they're angry at people who believe in God. But not all atheists are angry. Maybe a lot of atheists are angry, but just like not all old people are angry, which is a question I answered a couple hours ago. And some atheists are just smug. Like a lot of the atheists you see on YouTube, or somebody like Richard Dawkins, I mean, they're just smug as all get out. They're not angry. They just like are in love with themselves. They're just delighted with themselves. And they're just amused at the very idea that somebody wouldn't believe the same way they do. But angry atheists, yeah, I think they're just kind of intolerant of people who disagree with them. Like a lot of leftists are that way too, especially nowadays. It wasn't always that way. So I think most atheists are bitter and angry because they kind of validate their own opinions by the opinions of others. And if a lot of other people don't believe the same thing as them, it kind of casts shade on their own beliefs, and they're kind of offended by that, I would assume. There was one atheist in particular that used to rage at me on minds.com, which is sort of like alt Facebook. I don't do much on Minds anymore. But I used to, when I was a monk especially, that was like the one social media site that I actually participated in, with memes and that kind of thing. And there was this one guy who just raged at me. And he had the idea that all religions are just invented by like people in power in order to keep people like repressed. And he actually used this argument. He's like trying to argue Buddhism. He was ignorant of Buddhism. He's actually trying to argue Buddhism with me, saying the very fact that Gautama, the Buddha, was of the upper classes. He was a kshatriya of the nobility. That itself demonstrates that he was just trying to keep everyone down. And it's like, no, he renounced all that. So, yeah, I have had some interactions with at least one. He was just really, he never said anything positive, except maybe about himself. But he was just this bitter, angry atheist. But most of the ones you see on YouTube, they're more the smug type. They're not really angry and bitter. So the angry, bitter ones they're just sort of pissed off that people don't believe the same thing they do. And it's not just atheists who are like that. Well, maybe, I mean, Marxists tend to be atheists, so yeah. But it's not just people over the issue of atheism. It's just that kind of person who, I mean, they don't really have faith in anything. That they just, I mean, it's sort of an affront to them that someone would disagree with them, that someone would believe something that they consider to be bullshit. You know, it kind of undermines their own certainty, and they resent that. But then the ones who really are certain about their atheism are just smug. So I think I answered that one. So I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Kaizen or Kazen, which always reminds me of the man Kazin Wars. But I assume Kazen is not an alien with like ears that go up like a fan, like the Kazin were. So anyways, Kaizen or Kazen says, recently went down a Ramana Maharshi wormhole listening to the David Godman talks. Fascinating. There are a lot of stories about devotees having spontaneous mystical experiences with permanent personality changes. Some of them were basically looked in a samadhi state for years afterwards. I think maybe he means locked in a samadhi state for years afterwards. Were these devotees experiencing nibbana? Out of all the modern mystics I have read about, I would consider Ramana Maharshi to be the captain of the team. What they were experiencing exactly, I cannot say. But Ramana Maharshi supposedly had the ability of like somehow triggering enlightenment in people who were dying. Like I think he did this to his own mother. You know, he'd be like laying his hands on their forehead and maybe touching like their heart with the other hand or something as they are dying, and just somehow create some sort of spiritual circuit or something so that they were kind of in tune with his own enlightened consciousness as they died, and it just helped them to fade out instead of being reborn. I think he did that with his favorite cow also. But exactly what they were experiencing, I cannot say because I wasn't there. I didn't experience it myself, but I'm kind of doubtful that that if they were locked in a samadhi state for years afterwards with a permanent personality change, maybe, or it could just be that they had some sort of like relative awakening experience. They were in a higher state of consciousness, but still not fully enlightened. Because you experience nibbana for years, then, I mean, that's it. You're enlightened. Supposedly, like if you're like an Arya, but not quite fully enlightened, you might experience like a flash of nibbana, you know, for like a split second. But that's just orthodox Theravada, and I'm a little bit skeptical even of that. Let's see. I mean, I can accept that. I mean, you can get glimpses, even though you're not fully enlightened. You can still get kind of glimpses of the goal, or, you know, the highest state, the absolute, because it's always here. All it takes is a thinning of the veil and it can shine through. But whether somebody can be in a state like that continually for years, I mean, and then stop being in that state, that's questionable. Although, like I said earlier, that Ramana Maharshi himself, when he first had his awakening, he was mute for like 2 years. It took him like 2 years before he could like reconcile this new state of consciousness with the old state of consciousness. You know, like the absolute with the conventional. It took him like 2 years before he finally was able to start speaking again. But what happened to these people, I really can't say. I wasn't there. I really don't know much more about it than what Kaizen or Kazen is mentioning here. I did read about Ramana Maharshi, but I didn't read about how people were having permanent personality changes that were locked into a samadhi state for years. I didn't read about that part in the book that I read. So I really can't say what the devotees were experiencing. I mean, it's possible with an enlightened being, just damn near anything is impossible, or anything is possible. You know, like I was saying with Neem Karoli Baba, he would just break rules. He didn't care. He was no longer constrained by that kind of stuff. So Ramana Maharshi, he was definitely a major heavy hitter in 20th century spirituality. I mean, he was the saintliest of the saints. I mean, there was never any, that I'm aware of, never the slightest hint at any kind of scandal with him. That he was just a genuine saint, in addition to possibly being fully enlightened, even though he was a Hindu. So, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And we're almost done. Xenothoid is the last person on the list. But it always sneaks up on me. So Xenothoid says, can you explain the difference between inaction and non-action? And that's a good question. Inaction is just not acting. It's just like remaining motionless. Inaction, you know, like an inanimate object, or, you know, someone who's just sitting in a chair. He's relatively inactive. You know, he's still going to be fidgeting a little bit, maybe. You know, his abdomen's going to be rising and falling as he breathes. His eyes are going to be moving around, maybe. But it's a relative inaction. But non-action, like mentioned in Chinese texts, like the Tao Te Ching, is Wu Wei, which means non-action, no action. And that's a different kind of thing altogether. That's sort of like the behavior of an arahant. Because karma, I mean, the literal translation of karma into English is action. So an enlightened being, they're not creating karma anymore. Therefore, an enlightened being is not creating action. I mean, he's still talking, walking around, but it's not inaction. It is more non-action, or wu wei, where he's so detached that he's not making karma anymore. So there's no longer any subjective, like being enslaved to a habit pattern kind of a thing. There's no delusion motivating his actions. And so he's detached from samsara, so that as far as samsara is concerned, he's not leaving any tracks. You know, he's like Kwai Chang Caine walking across the rice paper and leaving no tracks behind. That's kind of symbolic of Wu Wei, or non-action, where, I mean, it's outwardly there's action, but there's no like momentum to it. There's no karmic consequence to it, really, other than other people who are like unenlightened people who are observing that. They might have a reaction that is karmic, but the person himself, the enlightened sage, you know, he's just, in a way, he's just a mirror reflecting other people's karma back at them. So he's not creating any karma because he's just detached. So I think that would be how I would describe it. Although, like, a Taoist might describe Wu Wei or non-action differently, but still it's the same general principle of you're not making any ripples. You're not leaving tracks. That you might outwardly seem to have an action, but it's like there's no momentum to it, so to speak. So I'm going to move on to Xenothoid's second question, which is, can you answer the dragon's question at 1 minute and 24 seconds in this video? And the video in question is on YouTube, which is called Pathurnax's Wide Words. And it's on the Philokali Artographer channel of YouTube. And the dragon's question is, it's a question I heard in a philosophy class in college. It's kind of a trite question, actually. And it's kind of a leading question that I think most people who ask that question are expecting a certain answer to be the correct answer. And so anyway, the dragon says, what is better, to be born good or to overcome your evil nature through great effort? And when I was in university, my philosophy professor made essentially the same question, and he considered it to be better to overcome your evil nature through great effort. I mean, what is praiseworthy about being born a saint? It's more praiseworthy and therefore better to be born a sinner and then redeem yourself, to perfect yourself, you know? But let's say Albert Einstein was right and that time is the fourth dimension, then it would be better to just be born good, because then you're good longer. You know, it's like you start being good earlier so that you have a less badness and more goodness by being born good. So, I mean, better is a value judgment. Different people it's like a matter of opinion, I guess, which is better. But it seems to me that, I mean, ultimately they'd be equivalent, or if anything, you could say that it's better just to be born good, because then you're good longer. You know, you're not bad. You erase, you eliminate all the badness that would have happened if you started off bad and then gradually became good. Even though it's through your own noble efforts and so forth, still there's all this badness that's there unnecessarily if you could have chosen just to be born good to begin with. And forget all the sentimentality. It's largely a matter of sentimentality that people would prefer the second, that it's more praiseworthy and therefore better that you start off bad, or at least, you know, imperfect, and then strive through heroic efforts to become good. When, I mean, obviously, if you're good from the beginning, then you're good longer. There's more good in that. Not just setting aside the value judgments. But this reminds me of what I consider to be a better question that I saw in a movie called Avalon, which is one of my favorite movies, by the way. If you can watch a movie called Avalon, it's an excellent movie, and it's a spiritual movie, like a parable of enlightenment. And it's a science fiction movie in the genre or genre of virtual reality. Like The Matrix is a good one, The 13th Floor, or let's see, Existence is another one. To some degree, Dark City would be another one, kind of on the fringe of that genre. But it's like the virtual reality, like a computer-generated virtual reality that is symbolic of samsara. And you've got the person in this virtual reality trying to transcend the virtual reality. So anyways, there's this character in this virtual reality called the Bishop. And he says, and it's with regard to a video game. This virtual reality is a video game in the future that you can enter into, and some people get lost in the video game. So anyways, the Bishop says, which is the greater challenge? Which is the better game? Which would you choose given a choice? The sort of game that you think you can win but can't, or alternatively, one that seems to be impossible but isn't. And then he says that the game, the perfect game, is like a delicate balance between those two. That's how the game developers are trying to do it. And it's symbolic of samsara and enlightenment. Enlightenment is the same kind of enigma. You know, it's like we're living in a samsaric world where you think you can transcend it, you think you can perfect it, but can't. Or alternatively, it's like balanced, and one that seems to be impossible but isn't. So I consider that to be more profound than the dragon's question and the philosophy professor's question when I was in college of, you know, which is better, to be born good or to overcome your evil nature through great effort. Anyways, I'm just going to move on to the very last question. The last question of this Q&A, also from Xenothoid, which starts with a Z, or a Z if you happen to be in the UK or Australia or New Zealand or whatever. So it's kind of symbolic, isn't it? So symbolic. Anyways, his question is, why are memories typically lost upon death? And I guess the main reason, from just a samsaric point of view, is because you've got a new brain. You've got a different brain than the one previously. So, I mean, that's the easy answer. You don't remember your past lives because you got a different brain now. But there are many cases. If you read one of the books by Ian Stevenson, you can see that some small children still remember their previous lives, and then they gradually forget it as they get older because they start getting lost in this version of samsara, and maybe their parents are kind of creeped out by their kid talking about being a different person and so forth, and they just kind of suppress it. Sometimes, parents can even get angry, especially fathers, kids talking about being a different person and so forth. Just shut up about that. And so they just eventually lose it. But, it's like, first of all, you're not the same person. So, it's like the same stream of karma, the same psychic momentum goes from one life to the next, but it's not necessarily specific memories. And there can be like some of those memories can make it through to the next life, but there's all this trauma and commotion and stuff going on. First, you're like unconscious in your mother's womb. And then there's all this commotion of being born and the bright lights and all this stuff that is just completely disorienting. And then you're in the process of just being a baby that really can't think very well yet. It's like the myelin sheaths on your neurons are not fully developed yet and so forth, going with the standard rules of this version of reality. And so in a way, rebirth is sort of like, one birth is one finger on this hand and another birth is this finger on this hand. And this finger doesn't remember being this finger because it never was this finger, but it's all part of the same hand. It's kind of a deal like that. That's another way of explaining it, I suppose. But there are some people who can remember past lives. My father claimed to remember a number of past lives. The Buddha supposedly remembered thousands and thousands of his past lives, some of which are supposedly recorded in Jataka stories. But the correct answer as to why memories typically are lost upon death is something that I can't really answer. I've given my best guesses. You got a new brain. It's not really you anyway. It's just sort of a continuation on the same theme, but it's not the same person. And also, it's just all this stuff happens between lives that can just cause you to forget. You don't even remember what you did like on your second birthday. It's this same life, but it happened so long ago and all this stuff happened in between. And then there's like the issue of your nervous system wasn't fully developed, which would theoretically cause you to forget a lot of things, not only that happened in this life, but happened in previous lives and so forth. So I assume all of that has something to do with it. And that's it. That's my answer to that question. And that's the last question, the last answer on this Q&A. And so, like I should be saying at the beginning, but I never do, I always say it at the end. If you have any questions that you think I can maybe answer, especially about Theravada Buddhism, early Buddhism, meditation, spirituality in general, philosophy in general, Eastern and Western, that kind of thing, Burma, me personally, anything you think maybe I can answer, feel free to ask the question and I'll do my best to answer it as I did this time and in all previous occasions. And like and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and feel free to look at the URL links, especially if you want to study up on semas, where this book is for sale on Amazon along with 2 others. And be happy.